think what we'll do is we'll set up a meeting date. Liz and I'll send an email out, tell folks we need to make a quorum, ask folks if they're planning on regularly attending the meetings, and if not, we'll send you a list of those names.
Okay.
Because we got to move that ship along.
Well, we're having trouble with the time of meetings. There's friction.
I get it. I get it. It's a big challenge getting these up and running, and I appreciate all you've done in Putney to get this up and going. And I will find it, I'll tease it out of all our meeting minutes, all the people that have been approved for Putney.
I have Putney people.
Oh, you do?
Yeah.
Awesome.
Can you, I'm the clerk, so I'm asking as a clerk, do you remember what meeting minutes were, what date when they were approved?
Yeah, the parents/community members were on November 20th, and the 4 faculty members were on the 4th of December.
The 4th of December?
Mm-hmm. I sent you this list, Amy.
Yeah, I have it.
Oh, you do? Oh.
Bing, done. Thank you, Anne. Done before
I only did that for Putney, I didn't do it for anybody else. So.
I haven't had a request from anybody else, so we'll go with that. And so, with that, I assume there's no other public comment on non-agenda items. We have one very short executive session under 1 VSA 313 to discuss evaluation of an employee.
So Mary has set up a room for us so that Rich can stay here.
Mary, you're the best.
Isn't she the best?
Do what I can.
Thank you.
I even turned the heat on.
Oh, and this works out for you too.
Do you have a decision?
I don't know.
Thank you. Sorry, I should have.
I'll be returning to Washington on the next plane, and we will be facing a reconvening of Congress in the aftermath of the President's decision to strike General Soleimani. The question before us is not whether that was a legitimate decision. The question is whether it was a wise decision. General Soleimani has been responsible for the death of many American soldiers. Iran has been a bad actor in the region. But the fundamental question for the president is always, will a decision that he makes enhance or diminish our national security? Will that decision make us safer or less safe? Secretary Pompeo is insisting that a result of this attack will make Americans safer. That's preposterous. There's no evidence whatsoever to indicate that. Let me just go through a few things that have happened since the president's action. Number one, the Iraqi parliament has voted that all troops in Iraq be expelled precipitously, without any planning, and immediately. Second, the Iraqi citizenry that had been on the street protesting Iranian interference in Iraqi affairs has dissolved, and Iraqis are united in their anger at the U.S. as a result of us having an attack on their soil. Number three, the Iranians who were on the street and protesting the policies of their own government are now united in their opposition to the United States. Number 4, virtually all commentators say that as a result of this action, it all but makes certain that Iranians, who said themselves that they intend to do this, will attack our diplomats, our generals. They want to retaliate in what they say is a proportionate way to respond to this. The irony, too, is that President Trump, who has said that he wants to bring our troops home from the endless wars in the Middle East, and incidentally, I support him in that effort, the opposite has happened. Instead of bringing troops home, he's just deployed from Fort Bragg another 3,500 troops to go to the region. Also, all our embassies are now on alert, and we're bringing American personnel home. So the notion that Secretary Pompeo is trying to promote, that this action has made us safer, is absurd, and is belied by the fact that the president is ordering troops to the region, ordering a stand down in our embassies, putting embassies on high alert, doing enhanced interrogation of Iranian citizens coming through our border crossings. So this was a decision that has had the absolute opposite of what the president states was his goal: deterrence and safety. It's escalation and insecurity. Now, when I return to Washington, I want to do a couple of things. First of all, when I get off the plane, I'll be taking the metro to the Capitol, and I'm going immediately to the secure briefing room at the Intelligence Committee to read the raw intelligence. I want to get to the bottom of this. Let me be frank. I don't believe what the president has said about the planning. And in fact, the Iraqi Prime Minister has said that Soleimani was there for discussions. But I want to look at the raw intelligence, and I'll have an opportunity to do that immediately upon my return to Washington. I'll be going to the Intel Committee to review those documents this afternoon. Second, I want to have hearings on this decision and get to the bottom of this decision. Any decision of this consequence is something that should be fully vetted by the National Security Council, because the consequences are inevitable, and it is absolutely essential for the well-being of our country that a president, in making this decision, have the benefit of a full vetting process. What's likely to happen down the line as a result of this decision? The president wasn't even in Washington. He wasn't in the Situation Room. He wasn't dealing with the National Security Council staff who could raise the proper questions. He was table hopping down at Mar-a-Lago when he made this decision. I want to have public hearings to get to the bottom of this, including as much revelation of this so-called intelligence that the president claims was the basis of his decision. Third, I'll be supporting War Powers resolutions, as I have in the past, to limit the authority of the president to use military force in Iran, in effect to go to a war with Iran, without coming to Congress for a vote, a debate on this question. I'll be sponsoring or supporting legislation to limit or prohibit funding for attacks on Iran. I've been a founding member, I am a founding member of the No War in Iraq caucus. The last thing we need after Iraq, after Afghanistan, is another war in the Middle East. And again, I'm astonished at this because I was in agreement with the president's stated goals of bringing our troops home. That made sense to me. It was overdue. And yet the president has taken an action that totally gets in the way of accomplishing that goal. It makes the likelihood of our being able to do that in a timely way much, much more difficult. Finally, I will be a voice for de-escalation. We do not need another war, and we need de-escalation. And any of us in Congress who can do everything possible to try to send a message that we don't want a war. It's not in our interest. I will be a voice for de-escalation. My hope, too, is that the Iran nuclear deal, which the president tore up, saying that the 15 years of a guarantee of no nuclear weapons in Iran was not enough time. Iran, after 5 years, as a result of this action, has said they're getting out of it. So what the president did on the nuclear deal is claim 15 years is too little, and it's ended after 5 as a result of his action. Very dangerous. There'll be many of us encouraging our European allies to approach Iran to see if there's any way to de-escalate and maintain the provisions of that agreement. The last thing we need, the last thing the world needs, is a nuclear-armed Iran. So those are the things that I'll be doing when I return to Washington. Thank you, and I'm available for questions.
I assume the published reports are true that you had no notice whatsoever about this, you and your colleagues in Congress?
That's correct.
And what do you make of that? Would you like to have been notified of this? I assume.
There's two issues here. Okay? One is the decision to go to war or to take a very significant military action that escalates the prospects of a full-out war are immensely consequential. And it is the responsibility of Congress to make the yes or no decision on putting our troops in harm's way. The president has no regard for the role of Congress in general, and in this case specifically with respect to the likely outcome of his decision. So it is absolutely important that any president respect the War Powers Act and also respect the process of notifying the so-called Gang of Eight when there's going to be a significant military action. So I'm very disappointed. But what I'm really concerned about, more than that process being abrogated, is the decision itself. Again, Soleimani is a bad guy. He's killed American soldiers. America has to deal with a lot of bad people. This bad person, Soleimani, at times was working in coordination with our allies in Iraq and with the United States in going after ISIS. So this is not a question of whether Soleimani was a bad guy. This is a question of whether the president's decision was a wise decision in our long-term national interest. And it wasn't. It clearly wasn't. And all the consequences that we're having to deal with, how much more destabilization there is in the region, is all directly related to this decision. And it's completely contrary to what the president has stated is his goal. I mean, we are sending troops back to the region instead of taking them home. And on the day, 2 days ago, the Iraqi government voted to expel all American troops. And then the Pentagon sent a letter saying they were going to comply. And then they, shortly after that, said, whoops, that was just a mistake. It's an indication further that amateur hour is in charge at the White House.
I think immediately after this happened, I think it was the 3rd of January, the internet kind of exploded kind of with fearful jokes of World War III. I mean, are you afraid of any retaliation and what could happen next?
Well, of course I'm fearful of retaliation. The Iranians have said they will. And also keep in mind, the Iranian regime is not a good, it's a bad regime. And the thing they care about more than anything else, more than their people, they crushed dissent there just recently. The thing they care about and will fight to preserve is their hold on power. And their street, everyday Iranian citizens are demanding revenge. And not that the Iranian mullahs needed this, but they've got enormous pressure from their population, from their citizens, to retaliate. So everyone expects that there will be retaliation. I hope there won't. I hope cooler heads will prevail, and it will take some signals from the president himself that he's committed to de-escalation. But when you see all of our embassies are on alert, when we see that we're sending troops to the region, not bringing them home, when you see the heightened security, unjustified in my view, about Iranian citizens or U.S. citizens of Iranian descent getting grilled at our border areas, it's an indication that our government itself is going on a much higher state of alert in anticipation of a retaliatory action. And the security, of course, at the White House has been enhanced.
Do you have any expectation that the president would abide by or respect any action Congress takes with regard to the war powers?
Not by his conduct as president so far. You know, this is a separate issue, but it's quite important. Since 9/11, there's been an immense buildup in the military and an immense concentration of authority in the president. And we've gotten away from the co-equal branch having to have a debate where each one of us has to vote on this enormously consequential decision as to whether or not those citizens among us who are willing to serve in the military get the benefit of a wise decision rather than a foolish decision. And the president is intensifying this with this action. And again, what's mystifying, but it goes to the impulsive nature of his decision making, is the president has stated repeatedly he wants us to bring the troops home. He doesn't want to be in endless wars in the Middle East. That we're oil independent. We don't even have that reason anymore. Yet this impulsive decision is totally thwarting him achieving his own objectives. And the irony, too, is that people like me would support him in those efforts.
Congressman, some of us have known you for a long time. You do have a different tone today. You are serious about this. You have a different face, you have a different tone.
You know, I've been to Iraq a number of times in Afghanistan, and I've been to Walter Reed, and I've seen the extraordinary bravery of our soldiers. You know, we lost 5,000 lives in Iraq. We have 20,000 soldiers who suffered crippling injuries. They're suffering. Their families are suffering. There's real consequences to foreign policy decisions. And the most inspiring experience most of us have had in Congress is meeting some of these young men and women who, without complaint, without fear, show up for duty when the president says it's time, and they'll go into Iraq. That decision, their patriotism, deserves that the members of Congress and the president treat these decisions about going to war with enormous gravity, because the people who are paying the price are the soldiers, not the president, not the members of Congress. Our duty is to be as focused and sober-minded as possible before we ask any of our fellow citizens to put that uniform on and risk their lives. And this decision that the president made is such a step towards escalation. And when escalation happens, there's no ability to control where that ends. So yes, I'm very serious about this because of the consequences that can happen to our men and women in uniform and to our country.
Congressman, in your opinion, you're on the Intelligence Committee. What was the proper response, and how do we curb the influence of Iran in Iraq?
Well, two things. There is an enormous amount of discontent in Iraq about Iranian influence. And in fact, Iraqis had burned a consulate. They burned it down. That's how intense the protest was. Why would we get in the way of that? You know, at a certain point, what we know is Iraq has to make a decision whether it wants to have a civil war or create a civil society. So this decision of escalation thwarted that. We should be doing everything we can, obviously, to promote a strong and stable government that meets the needs of its citizens in Iraq, and we should be tough with Iran. But those are day-by-day decisions where you have to take into account what the consequences are and how does it advance or diminish our long-term interest. And our long-term interest clearly is stability.
You said don't believe the president and you say that we're on intelligence or something. Are you more precise about what you don't believe? Are you referring to, are you saying you don't believe there was any imminent attack?
What it looks like to me is that the president, as he does, was watching TV. He was very upset about the demonstrations around our embassies, understandably so. He wanted to do something decisive. According to the press reports, the military gave him a list of options, and they included, according to the press, this attack on Soleimani, where, according to the reports, they put that in as an extreme example so the other options would look reasonable. And of course, that was a mistake on the part of the military to suggest this as an option. But it was really the responsibility of the president to make a wise decision. So I don't believe it, but that's why I want to look at the raw intelligence and I want to get to the bottom of it.
On another note, what do you make of the news that John Bolton is willing to testify in the Senate?
I think it puts the burden on Senator McConnell to do the right thing. Bolton should testify, Mulvaney should testify, Secretary of Defense should testify, Pompeo should testify, and this is very, very important. Before they testify, we should have access to those emails, because they'll say one thing and the emails say another. In order to get the real testimony, we have to have the real evidence, and that's the emails. So Bolton saying he's coming forward, I think, makes it very, very clear that he's willing to testify, and the only reason he wouldn't is because the president is holding him back or McConnell is holding it back.
Do you have any insight from your caucus as to when Speaker Pelosi might transmit these articles of impeachment?
I don't, but I expect it'll be sooner rather than later. I mean, keep in mind, Congress has been in recess until today, so so I think it will happen sooner rather than later. But I do think in this period of recess, the question has been raised and really largely answered that Senator McConnell has no interest in a fair trial. He wants a speedy dismissal. But I think the things like Senator Murkowski saying that she may want witnesses, Senator Collins saying that, Mr. Bolton saying that he would be willing to testify, all of that, I think, allows the American people to draw a conclusion and suggest, let's have a fair trial. Let's get to the bottom of it.
Do you think that agreement to bring witnesses, to call witnesses, needs to be in place before the articles are transmitted?
You know, that's kind of a tactical decision. The bottom line here is that at a certain point, we're going to have to trust the Senate to do the right thing. And what's very hard is when Senator McConnell says he's working in close coordination with, in effect, the defendant, with the president, it's very, very difficult to have that confidence. And I mean, the American people are entitled to have a fair trial. And that means one where the senators are impartial jurors. They might be, obviously there's politics here, there's partiality, but there's a duty that the institution has to at least try to get the evidence that backs up or refutes the allegations in the articles of impeachment that we in the House are sending over.
Should we expect further statements from you later today or tomorrow once you've reviewed this?
Well, I won't be, whatever it is I read in the secrecy of the Intel Committee, I won't be able to share. It's one of the reasons I'm pushing for public hearings, because I think that you're entitled, the people I represent are entitled to know what I know, and I want them to know it, and I'm going to be pushing hard for public hearings.
Just to kind of review, you're reading the intel today, and you're kind of voting.
We're not voting, no. No, there's going to be, the Speaker's putting together the legislation on war powers and also prohibitions on funding for action in Iraq, in Iran. You know, I'm supportive of that, and as you know, I'm an original member of the No War in Iraq caucus. My goal is de-escalation here. I mean, I'm extremely upset with the president's decision. I think it's created a significant problem and challenge for our country, significant danger. But I think the more of us that are on the side of de-escalation, the more prospects we have to stabilize the situation.
The previous administration, as well as the administration before that, both had a chance to take out this guy, Soleimani. They decided not to, as I understand it, because they thought that the dangers to the country would be greater than the payoff for removing him. Were you in on any explanations from the Obama administration as to why they made that calculation?
No. Now, keep in mind, Soleimani's gone, but he's been replaced. So whatever the plans were that the president's talking about, they're still in place. And, you know, but what is different is we're sending more troops to the region. Our embassies are in heightened state of alert. There's more security at the White House. There's more security at the border. There is bewilderment among our allies. And the population in Iraq and the population in Iran that was supportive of what our long-term goals were. Iraqi Street was protesting Iranian involvement in Iraq. We want Iran out of Iraq. And the Iranian population that is suffering under the cruel regime was protesting. Now, Iran and Iraq, their citizenry, are united in outrage at the United States. And that all happened as a result of this action by the president. That was the outcome. Now, had the president had a reflective process to make a consequential decision, it's absolutely certain that all of these likely scenarios would have been discussed and considered. And in the cool of the moment, when you start going beyond the impulsive desire to show how tough we are, you start realizing, well, wait a minute, this is not necessarily going to help us, it's going to hurt us. You take a half step back. You know, the president has had some restraint in the Middle East. When our drone was shot down, for example, and he completely lost it here, lost restraint here. So thank you.
Welcome everyone. It's a little bit past 6. We are going to get started, and as people trickle in, they can be filled in. Just an overview of tonight's agenda. We're going to be looking at all the states updates, an update from North Star, be looking at the panel legislative change draft, and also reviewing the draft annual report. Does anybody have any amendments to the agenda tonight? Seeing none, we're going to introduce our panelists. Chris, we'll start down at your end and work our way around.
Chris Camp, Executive Director, Wyndham Regional Commission, and proud alumnus of Louisiana State University, which is playing in the college football championship tonight.
Representative Laura Sibilia, House Energy and Technology.
Use the mic.
Representative Laura Sibilia, House Energy and Technology.
Representative Sarah Coffey, and I'm here at the appointment of the Speaker of the House.
Emily Davis, citizen appointee, Senator Pro Tem Tim Ash.
Lissa Weinman, citizen appointee from Tim Ash also.
Bob Leach, governor's appointee.
Josh Under, Governor appointee.
Brett Long, Deputy Commissioner of the Department of Economic Development.
Emily Bodecker, Commissioner, Department of Environmental Conservation.
Bill Irwin, representing the Agency of Human Services, work for the Vermont Department of Health.
Corey Daniels, I'm the Senior Manager for the Isvisi installation with North Star for my Yankee.
David Pearson with North Star.
Folks on the line, if you want to introduce yourself.
Hi, this is Bob Gustafson, State of New Hampshire, appointed by the governor to represent the 6 communities in New Hampshire that were part of the EPZ.
Very good. We will review and approve the December 2019 meeting minutes. There were a few spelling errors that we need to get correct, and also a vote fix that we need to do as well. Tony, if you want to run through those for us, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah. Sorry.
I think this has gone dead on me.
No.
Oh, okay. There's 2.
Try now, Tony.
There we go, finally. The original configuration. Okay, so on page 6, we have 2 typos. And these are both on line 41. There's an is towards the end of the line that should be an R, A-R-E. And then also, I don't think we need the on that same line, so I'm recommending that be deleted. That's pretty minor. On page 9, line 15, we have a reference to one of the Issues Committee meetings noted as being on June 24th. That was actually on July 24th, so that needs to be corrected. And then the significant one on page 10, lines 13 and 14, in one of the votes, we had originally listed that Corey Daniels and Emily Davis voted yes, when in fact on those votes they had abstained.
I think, Tony, there was another vote that I abstained. It was the October meeting minutes.
Okay. I can go back. Actually, I don't have a set of the minutes here. I'm kind of winging this.
Right.
But I can go back and change that. So you abstained on the meeting minutes vote.
The vote of the October meeting minutes. I think it said that I voted yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll entertain a motion to accept the minutes as corrected.
So move.
Seconded.
Moved and seconded. Let's go down through the list.
Aye.
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 Abstain. Okay.
Aye.
Okay.
Oh, hang on. No. Abstain.
Bill Irwin, abstain.
Aye.
Aye.
On the line?
Aye.
You catch the abstention?
Okay, I just want to review the abstains. We have Commissioner Bodecker, Dr. Irwin, and Deputy Secretary Long, so abstaining. And any others? I think the rest were all ayes, is what I heard. Okay. Thank you.
All right. Next on the agenda is North Star update.
All right, good evening and Happy New Year. Next slide, Tony, please. So this slide will be a repeat, and you'll see it with a few different photos that was taken out the window when it was still cold out, which clearly that will change from day to day. Our project schedule, macro view, this is a recap, also has not changed. Our dry fill storage is complete. Our large component removal is in progress. Our decommissioning and decontamination efforts are ongoing, and the spent fuel management will happen ancillary to all that effort. Next slide. A slightly more granular view of that macro schedule shows the large component removals, including alongside the reactor vessel and internal segmentation, the large component removal moving through the steam plant and continuing to take advantage of large targets of opportunity, which include the main warehouse and our advanced off-gas structure for demolition. Next slide. So it's only been a month since the last meeting. Our safety performance remains acceptable. We've had 0 lost time accidents to date with our North Star staff, with over 300,000 hours of work on site. We've reset our dose goals for 2020 after meeting them for 2019, and we're looking forward to, again, testing those targets and showing good performance from a dose management perspective. Our regulatory performance remains good. We had 0 cited and 0 non-cited violations in 2019. Our QA audits and self-assessments, along with peer benchmarks, confirm our safe and compliant operations and conservative performance. Overall, our production remains on track and in a couple areas ahead of schedule. We are a little slow with some of the reactor vessel work, and some of that is attributable to the later start we got and some of the conditions that the site was in at the time of the transaction. But overall, the bulk work remains on or ahead of schedule, and we remain optimistic that we'll complete the decommissioning well ahead of the target schedule of 2030. Next slide, please. At a request, and I know there'll be subsequent slides from some of the departments discussing it, there's some specific volumes and locations for materials that have been removed from the site and shipped. As far as radiological materials, we've shipped now approximately 122,000 cubic feet of waste to Texas. As far as non-radiological items go, our construction and demolition debris to Massachusetts, we've sent 1,521 tons. That went to sites in Wilbraham and Millbury. And as far as asbestos-containing materials, to Ohio and New Hampshire, 537 cubic yards. That went to Weinsberg and the waste management facility in Rochester, New Hampshire. And we have sent a good amount of scrap and recycled material to Matsushio Scrap Metal in Everett, Massachusetts, 237 tons. Additionally, we've sent 8 rail tankers of intrusion water in from our turbine building, about 181,000 gallons, 4 tankers each to Waste Control Specialists in Texas, and 4 to U.S. Ecology in Idaho. Next slide, please. The macro of our vessel segmentation overall won't change. The arrows along the bottom show the general path of the way that is decommissioned, and it's basically working from the top down. The containment head is complete. The reactor head is now segmented and shipped. The steam dryer is also done. We have flooded up, and we have commenced the separation of the steam separator. And there'll be a little more slide and detail on that. Ultimately, as a reminder, there are a few select components that will get cut up and stored separately and shipped in a specialized container at some point in the future. We consider those greater than Class C waste. It's a small amount, and it will only be 1 container, and it should be 1 overpack style, similar to the ones that are already on the independent spent fuel storage installation bed. Next slide. As you can see here, an overhead view, seeing the reactor, the large round pool area, all flooded up with water. To the left, just out of view of the slide, would be the spent fuel pool, and you can see the bridge and crane system that was originally used for moving fuel from the pool to the reactor and back. And to the right is a new bridge assembly working platform for the activities that happen in the dryer separator pit, which is also connected to the reactor vessel. That is actually broken into 2 discrete volumes now, so separate activities can occur within there. Next slide, Tony. This slide shows a large amount of trident clamps. These are effectively long poles with specialized fasteners on each end that will be used for the steam separator dismantlement. It's a large component with, if you would consider helical cyclones, from a top plate to a bottom plate, and as we cut that in half, it will basically dangle a little bit. I'll call it like a chandelier, and these poles will clamp those through those tubes or near those tubes and hold it into discrete components, so we can cut it effectively into 4 separate pieces and then in half, so ultimately it'll be 8 parts, and then those will get boxed up in special containers and shipped off. Next slide. This is just a photo of the water in the reactor. It kind of shows the clarity of the water that is there, and that's actually an instrument that is being used to perform a radiological survey. It's just kind of a neat photo. We threw it in. Next slide. This demonstrates the working bridge with folks on it who are actually performing some of the underwater work, prepping the steam separator for segmentation. You can actually see the steam separator that came out of the reactor vessel, the hole that we just saw the photo of with the instrument into it, which is towards the top front of the photo. Thanks, Tony. And it's been lifted up and slid back into the first half of the dryer separator bed. You can see the wall separating in the backside there. There's actually another working space behind it. And that is where that steam separator will be basically cut in half axially and then cut into 4 pieces from the top, if you think of it kind of like the way you chop up a pizza. Next slide. Kind of a close-up of some of the underwater cutting equipment. You can see we're actually removing some of the lifting lugs that would be in the way for the removal operations that we're going to conduct. You see the saw blade going through the material on the left and then a cut clean through on the right-hand photo. Next slide. So while that work is happening up on the refuel floor, we continue to work on the turbine deck. The turbine is missing. On the right-hand photo, you can see the large hole and opening that is the main condenser below. The large pieces of equipment on each side. On the left-hand side, these are the combined intercept valves. It's kind of hard to see if Tony can pull the cursor directly below the steam pipe that has got opening. There's a small water spray bottle right there to kind of give scale to how big this equipment is. But if you understand the robustness of the steam plant and how big this piping is, this is all Schedule 80, so it's 1-inch thick steel pipe that is 24 to 30 inches in diameter that runs basically from where the turbine was all the way to the reactor building and then into the reactor. So we're working our way backwards and removing all that equipment. There are 2 of these on each side of the turbine, and you can see the one on the left is had the pipe cut off of it. The other 2 on the right are still awaiting further dismantlement. Next slide. In addition to the work that's happening in the turbine building, folks have been interested in the ingress of the water into our lower levels of turbine structure, which is below the water table. We've put some intercept wells in place. We've developed those wells. We've tested the water outside of the turbine building, and it is clean. And we are currently trenching and installing some piping to connect that so we can sample and batch it. And we're working on the permitting so we can utilize the ability to send the water away before it enters the turbine building and gets any radionuclides or radiation to it. This will effectively be like a footer drain around the front corner of the turbine building, and it will eliminate some of the cost and improve the controls for any of the water that ingresses into the building. We haven't installed the pumps yet, but we have a good plan moving forward, and we're working with the appropriate state agencies for the permitting, and now we will conduct the discharging of that water. Next slide. So the other significant demo opportunities coming up, to the left of the large white structure in the bottom is the warehouse in what we called our combined maintenance office building. That all is scheduled to go away in the first part of this year into the spring. That'll be somewhat weather dependent. The final permitting and the start date for that will also be impacted by our resource allocation. The teams that we use out of Boston have other work to do, so we'll arrange that when it makes sense. And then the other small red circle you see, or square, is what we call our advanced off-gas building. And this is a very robust structure. The thinnest walls on that building are 4 feet thick with 2-inch rebar inside of them. And at the base, they're over 7 feet thick. So this is a pretty big target. But we plan on working on that as well, and again, the resources and the weather will help us decide when we actually start that, but it's scheduled to begin the first part of the spring. Next slide. A couple of photos of the inside of the warehouse, like we would with any demolition. All combustibles and materials have been removed. The final removals will require us to pull the light bulbs and the exit signs and all the universal waste, and then commence the permitting, and then the 90-day clock will start as long as we're all set up to go, and then we'll start knocking down the structures. Next slide. So, along with the actual physical work, and this slide hasn't changed much from when we were here last month, we've conducted the phase one. The site model is complete. So we know historically what's happened on the site all through its years of operation, combined with the history of the property before it and any legacy components that contributed to that. We've shared all that information with our friends at the Agency of Natural Resources. Their specialty consultants have weighed in on all the information. We've incorporated all their comments and made adjustments to that program. And we're working through that, and we're going to finish up a final report of that at the end of this month. It'll likely get turned around mid-February to late February, and then we'll continue to work on any plans for remediation or activities that will require cleanup for any sites that require it. Additionally, we've conducted 3 rounds of groundwater sampling, and I'm sure the other agency reports will talk about this a little bit. Next slide. So a reminder, we have all the information from previous activities that occurred at the site, even before we owned it. The last presentation was kind of long, and it got towards the end of this. I think I rushed this information a little bit. My apologies if any of it was confusing. The 17 areas of concern that we described previously, they're not new. They're not particularly exotic or exciting. They are just areas of interest that we understand would require additional look and sampling and characterization and potentially remediation. And of those, we had a couple that we determined will require some degree of remediation. Some of that will be natural attenuation. Some of it will be a small area where we will excavate and then check the margins and then apply the information discovered through the permitting process and determine if we can close those areas out. We're working through the sampling plans to finalize the scope and determine what remediation will occur on those. And the other state agencies, again, will be able to speak to that in some detail. We also have a subject matter expert with us in the audience today who also can answer some questions if there are more detailed questions. Next question. Next slide. Thanks, Tony. So now we're updating that site investigation report as I described. We'll design the remediation plans, and in the couple of areas we've determined that we will need to remediate, we'll work towards doing so, and we'll continue to support all the permitting and additionally determine sampling and remediation activities. And again, this process is very iterative as we conduct it. We work with all the agencies and their specialty consultants, often doing split samples and performing any correlation for the collection and analysis of the results, and then applying all the information learned into the remediation plan, and then hopefully completing the closeouts for each of these areas independently. So as we approach the end of the project and want to perform final site release, we're ready to do so with all areas. But we found nothing surprising. All the areas that we did find contamination of any type, and it was mostly areas that had some diesel fuel oil spills. We will conduct those remediations. One of those was the connecting lines that went from the old large 75,000 gallon emergency diesel fuel oil system tank to where the fill connections were underneath of the slab of the warehouse. So as we remove that, we'll be able to discover exactly how far, if indeed there's been any migration, and determine the depth and size of the excavation or remediation that will occur. Next slide. One small note, we have finalized a contract with Antioch University to perform a site study and an inventory for use of the property for potential redevelopment options. as everyone on the panel and most of the public is aware, we have an MOU with the state of Vermont that has us look at certain characteristics of the site and consideration for leaving some of the infrastructure, even though it's of limited scope, and the ways in which we can best do that during our not redevelopment, but our remediation of the site will let us leave it in the best condition efficiently so future redevelopment can take advantage of that infrastructure in the best manner possible. We've also been in discussion with the Friends of Vernon. We have another meeting with them on Thursday. They've recently been bequeathed the Governor on House from Entergy. It's a historic property at the front entrance to the site, and some of the ancillary and adjacent spaces are on our current properties, and we're looking at the best ways in which that can fit into that whole process of making sure we're able to let the local stakeholders take best advantage of those. Next slide. So with that, I'll leave it open for questions. Chris?
Before I know you guys have a stormwater permit for the site and prep in the works. Where are you guys at in that process? And I know we've asked for, Wyndham Regional Commission asked for a public hearing. Do you guys know about when that'll be?
We're looking at submitting some of the paperwork on Wednesday for the permitting for the intercept wells, and then there'll be public notice associated with it following that, Chris. Does that answer your question?
I guess I thought the stormwater permit was for the whole site more than just the wells.
There is a stormwater permit that's for the whole site.
And you don't have that permit yet, right?
Yes, we've had a stormwater permit for the whole site the whole time it's been in operation.
Have you petitioned for a new one though?
There'll be one for the discharge of the intercepted water with the intercept wells, and that will be separate. Yes, Bill.
Under production, it says here that the reactor removal was slightly behind schedule following transaction delays. Do you mind telling me what happened there, or us what happened there?
Sure, Bob. Some of that is we originally, and if you recall, the original schedule for the transaction was to happen in the middle of 2018. We originally had intended to receive the site from Entergy with the spent fuel pool already cleaned and empty and dry. That work did not occur until after the transaction occurred, so North Star had to conduct all those activities, set the refuel up in a manner in which it could support some of the vessel segmentation commencement.
Thank you.
That's kind of the big rock. There was a few other things, but in the pre-work that we had originally determined that would benefit setting the site up for instantaneous moving forward, it wasn't quite in that condition.
Go ahead, Lauren.
Clarification on the stormwater and discharge that we were just talking about. The water that will be discharged, what is happening to that water now?
The water that was developed when we tested the wells to see how much came out of it was collected into frac tanks, and it's being stored. That water will likely be stored interimly in the large basin that the cooling tower was originally sited over on the west side. So we have about a 1.4 million gallon concrete vault there, and we will likely store the water there until we can batch and test it and make sure it's suitable for overboard discharge.
So, as I'm sure you probably can guess, my question is related to the water that's been trucked off. This is not the same water.
That is correct. It is not the same water.
Yes, thank you. I have a couple of questions. The first is about the demolition of the advanced off-gas building. If I recall, that building has below-grade space. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And I think that this may be the first of your structures to be demolished that does go below grade. Is that correct also?
That is correct.
And this is also the area where there was a condensate leak, and it was discovered in 2009 and then mitigated over the 2010 timeframe. And it is a building that goes to, I assume, bedrock for its foundation. And the question I have is, are you planning to do some exploration of the space up gradient of that building up against the foundation to see if there are any reservoirs of water that have collected? Because that's been the source at other sites of reservoirs of contaminated water. And it would be, it seemed prudent, and it wouldn't surprise me if it's in your plans, to evaluate that before you actually started to remove that wall, which functions as a dam to prevent the down gradient flow of water into the river. Am I correct in those assumptions, and are those a part of your plans?
Bill, you are correct in those assumptions. We also have sentinel wells that are located up gradient of that structure as well as down gradient of that structure, quite a few of them actually. And we've been monitoring that, the information that is there for quite some time. The source term that was originally available from that leak has diminished as expected to very low levels, but we will continue to do so. It's part of our regular quarterly sampling.
Great, appreciate that. And the second question is about the non-radiological areas of concern. I think it's really benefit to the panel that you have presented both in December and again tonight your definition of these areas. Specifically in December, you actually had maps that showed each of those. And I understand from my previous review of the preliminary site assessment that was negotiated among the parties back in the early stages after the plant shutdown, that the preliminary site assessment also came up with radiological areas of concern. Are you able to present the same sort of map of those radiological areas of concern and then give some sort of status as to the nature of those and what plans there are? Because I think it would benefit the panel to see both the non-rad side as well as the radiological side, which obviously for nuclear power plants becomes more problematic oftentimes than the non-radiological characteristics.
I can certainly look to update future presentations to include that information. We're not prepared to speak to it right now, but what I did describe at the last meeting was the initial assessment that we did on the site. With the instrumentation, we were able to drive around and take over 1.3 million discrete samples. We found 2 locations that were both explained as not areas of concern. One was a toolbox that we just had not recognized where it was, and we understood what it was. It was properly labeled and marked, and we just picked up, we'll call it a false positive reading that we had to validate what it was. And the other one was from the operations that were occurring right in front of the turbine loading bay. The little bit of shine that comes out of the building from the radiological materials that were in there, we also picked that up and noticed it, and then we were able to validate that in fact it was from the building where it was expected. So right now I don't believe there are any areas of concern radiologically, but I will definitely make sure we include that in future presentations.
Great, thank you.
Hi. Just the back to the non-radiological areas of concern. Can you, you said there were only 5 that were needing remediation, but I don't need I'm not asking for a long description, but if you could just give a description of a typical site, one typical area.
Sure. So we found a spot out of the cooling towers that has a little bit of what appears to have been a small diesel fuel oil leak, and additionally some potentially some herbicide materials. It's a small location. It would likely be no more than a 10 by 10 foot area that we would likely remediate down to about 18 inches. A typical remediation effort would be we would excavate the soil, take that soil, obviously collect it and package it appropriately for disposal. Then we would sample the margins of where we did the excavation, and then per the docket 8880 agreements with the MOU, we would bring in clean fill that meets all the criteria, and we would reload that, and then we would work with the agencies to do a release of that particular component. And then the one that I mentioned for the large fuel oil tank where the lines run under would be a little bit larger, but it's effectively the same process.
Okay, thank you.
And that's in compliance with the IRUL and the state agencies' oversight and, of course, a collaborative effort to make sure that that meets all the requirements. Thanks for the question, Derek. Good question.
Follow-up question to that. When do you anticipate all that work to be done? Like, what's your timeline? And I guess also I'm thinking about what is the timeline for the design of those remediation plans with agency input?
So those designs are occurring right now, and we will ultimately intend to do those remediations on an individual basis as soon as possible. So weather dependent, and once the plans are approved, and again, like we mentioned, it is a highly iterative process. So once we conduct those and do the additional sampling, determine that we are complete with it, we'll work with the agencies to close those out. But the goal is to, I'll use the term whack-a-mole, but to go after them one by one until they're all done as soon as reasonably achievable.
Just like spring 2020?
Absolutely, for some of them. And then some of them won't require remediation. Likely there's potential that natural attenuation will be the preferred method for them, and then that will just require continued monitoring to some level, and that'll be finalized with the specific agency involved and the plan as it's developed.
Sure. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, I don't see any more questions for North Star. Let's move on to A&R for their update.
Good evening. So as I think you're all very familiar with, the Department of Environmental Conservation's responsibility is for the non-RAD elements here on the site. And if you go to the first slide, Tony, this just overall is the timeline that we've been on. And so as has been mentioned in the North Star update, by the end of January is when we're expecting the results and the report from the supplemental site investigation. And as Corey mentioned, this was additional investigation that was required based on the first site assessment and the identification of areas of concern. The questions that Emily Davis was asking about each of those individual AOCs and where cleanup is required, that will be the step following when we have the full site investigation report that comes in at the end of the month. Each one of those will have its own plan and will be governed by the IRUL. And the IRUL is our kind of short way of saying the one rule that rules them all related to any hazardous site cleanup in the state. So this site will be held to the same standards and will follow the same cleanup process that any of our hazardous sites in Vermont goes through. Next slide, please, Tony. So of those AOCs that were identified, there were a number where we wanted to do some initial analysis. You can see the list here, site 3, 5, 7, and 8, the cooling towers, AOC 16, the rail line, and 17. And I want to just point out there, AOC, that is for the groundwater. So rather than it being a specific building or location where there have been a likelihood of spills of diesel or whatever it might be from past operation, this is looking at the groundwater underneath the site. And just want to point out here, as well as the petroleum byproducts, VOCs, TPH that we've looked at, we looked at metals and also PFAS here. That's a question I believe has come up in relation to other PFAS concerns and testing that we're doing statewide. So if you go to the next slide, please, Tony. So there are 4 rounds, as noted with the dates here, 4 rounds of sampling that began in May 2019. Those results were included in that initial investigation report. From the August 2019 sampling and November 2019, split samples were taken. So at times, DEC's engineer, Gerald Noyes, has been on site, and at other times, ATC, which is the contractor hired by the state to be additional expertise and additional eyes on the ground, has also been on site. And literally, split sampling is when you take a sample, you split it in 2. One gets sent off to the laboratory and monitored by ATC on the state side. The other gets sent off the laboratory, monitored by North Star on the other side. So what we have found comparing these samples is a great degree of similarity between the samples that we have. We do note that we found low-level groundwater contamination from the split samples we've looked at in August 2019, but I do want to note what is in low-level. And so that low level is metals that we found, but they are all below the MCL, the maximum contaminant level that's allowed. And there were no VOCs or TPHs found in that. So I wanted to note there was some, but I also wanted to explain what low actually means. And so the split samples from the 3rd round, again, they were taken by ATC. They're currently under review. The results from those will be in the end of January report. And the 4th round from February 2020 as planned, obviously they won't make it into a report deadline cutoff for the end of January, but we'll be able to report back on those after a certain passage of time when we've compared the results from the 2. Next slide, please, Tony. Thank you. So as was reported with the groundwater intrusion into the turbine building basement, the water that has been taken out of the interior has been shipped to facilities that can accept that kind of RAD waste, and it's been going to both US Ecology in Idaho and WCS in Texas. So this kicked off the effort to ensure that further groundwater was not intruding into the building itself, into the basement. So where we are with this right now, Haley and Aldrich, on behalf of North Star, has submitted permit applications so that that groundwater that is collected, that is from the 3 wells, that's collected, that is sent through the discharge system, that's being held in the basin, as explained, that will be held there until we actually have a permit for the groundwater discharge. It will be discharged through the cooling system pipes and out to the Connecticut River. For that discharge to happen, then we need to ensure that while it tests today at drinking water standards, and while it tests today that there is no RAD component to that, we need to ensure that it is monitored and tested on a regular basis. The fact that it's being held in the basin before it's discharged enables this monitoring, so that if anything should change as other excavation or remediation occurs on site, that we can understand what's going on. And the Department of Environmental Conservation is working with the Department of Health to develop those groundwater testing criteria that will then be in the A&R discharge permit, which is the authority, the jurisdictional mechanism that we have to require any additional remediation that might be needed. And just to reference back to the question that was asked about the stormwater permits as well, thank you for that. Then what is our typical practice is to wait until we actually have all of the permit materials in, so that we can review those permit materials. And then when we're confident we've got everything we need, at that point in time, when we issue a draft permitting decision, we can then notice the public meeting. And in past, not with this applicant in particular, but with past applicants, there can sometimes be an insufficient amount of information that's provided. So we make sure we've got all of that in hand and that we review for the draft permitting decision before we actually set the public meeting. So that is all in process at this point in time. And moving on to the next slide, Tony. about the asbestos abatement observation. So again, the state has contracted with ATC to provide additional expertise that the state does not happen to have on hand or utilize every day, and to have additional eyes on the ground. So the observation for the asbestos abatement has continued at the turbine building, the advanced off-gas building, and at the cooling towers when they were demolished. And a statewide asbestos review plan was conducted by ATC and Hillman, who's actually North Star's asbestos contractor. There have been a few situations where we have asked for additional samples. They have been collected and analyzed without any issues, with concurrence from North Star and their contractors. Next slide, please, Tony. And so these are the amounts of material that have been recovered and disposed of appropriately. Again, the non-RAD components. As you can see, it's quite substantial, and this was mentioned by Corey in North Star's presentation as well. 1,500 tons of demolition and construction debris. It's actually a Vermont state policy to try and recover as much construction and demolition debris as possible. This in fact did go to an out-of-state facility, both of them in Massachusetts, and so then Massachusetts laws govern what material is accepted. Same for the asbestos, as you can see it in New Hampshire and Ohio, 537 cubic yards of asbestos material and 237 tons of scrap metal, again going to a facility in Massachusetts. So again, a Vermont policy whereby we want to encourage recovery of materials, but once this is shipped out of state, it is receiving facilities state regulations that manage exactly what is received. And to the last slide, please, Tony, in terms of where we go from here. Obviously, there's a continued sampling. There is the supplemental site investigation report that is due in the end of January. All the remediation will then be governed by the IRUL. But just one note on a procedure that was required, that was established in the MOU, and this is the site restoration protocols. So this governs overall all of the non-RAD. And so this site restoration protocol essentially governs how we work together with North Star and the contractors, with the oversight of the state and ATC, to accomplish the non-RAD materials and remediation that is needed. So within this is now a signed agreement, and we are operating under this procedure. And I think one of the important things to note within that is there is a bi-weekly call. Things can change on a fairly rapid basis with a site of this kind of complexity. So we have a bi-weekly update with North Star and with their contractors. So as anything does change, if there are additional eyes on the ground that are needed, if we get sampling results, etc., that are back that need more attention, we are checking in on a bi-weekly basis. Thank you, and I'll leave that time for additional questions.
Go ahead, Chris.
Just a quick one. Commissioner, on the, I don't remember the exact language in the MOU, but basically if something is found that is either going to change the schedule or cost of the process, that's supposed to be, the state's supposed to be notified. So is this one of the vehicles by which the state could become aware of something that's going to be an issue in terms of money or time?
Absolutely, yes. And so with a bi-weekly check-in, then it does enable kind of real-time adaptation as needed for the management of that. To date, we have had, certainly not on the side where DEC is responsible, we've not had many surprises in terms of the operation of a site where we have diesel generators running. So the kind of non-RAD contamination has been pretty consistent with the experience that we've had with other sites for this type of contaminant. So this absolutely would be a mechanism by which we can be quickly alerted to any issues that do arise. We'll certainly be keeping a very close eye on this, especially as any other deconstruction activities might start to disturb any of the site and disturb kind of below the surface level. So that's a point at which we want to make sure that we've got regular and very real-time
Commissioner, this is just really a curiosity question. So in terms of the biweekly check-ins, what is that? Is that an on-site check-in? Is it on the phone? Approximately how long is it? Just what does that look like in general?
That's a phone call. There are various site visits that are scheduled in and around these, so we certainly have regular eyes on site, or I'd say frequent rather than regular, like every single Tuesday. It's frequent. So this is an opportunity to check in. It's on the phone bi-weekly. On that phone, we have both the engineer who's assigned to the site, Gerald Noyes. We have other of our site's management staff as needed. For example, if there are concerns about PFAS, we bring in one of the PFAS experts. We also have on the phone Chuck Schur, who is the director of the division. And we also have Jordan Gonda from the legal team, who actually was working on the MOU and the protocols. So we can have an engineer at the staff level, management oversight, and legal staff who are reviewing what information comes in. And in addition, there are the times that staff from DEC are on site and the ATC is on site, and then ATC is obviously communicating with us directly outside of these bi-weekly meetings with anything that they're observing.
Okay, seeing no other questions, we'll move on to the Vermont Department of Health update.
Yes, thank you. I'll wait for Tony to get the slide up. If you could put that on presentation, that'd be great.
Yeah, if I can get this to work.
Slideshow? Top middle, slideshow? It's a word.
Okay, I'm sorry, I'm just not seeing it right now. I have the wrong slide.
The very top middle.
Oh, got it. Okay, yeah, sorry about that.
From beginning?
There we go.
Great. With all that, I only have a picture of the site, which I thought was interesting because it is a picture of a photo of the site that is more current. Most of the images you see on the internet are old images. This is fairly recent. I don't know exactly how this came about. It was not me, just so that folks know that. Next slide, please. So we are working with our state partners to oversee the decommissioning and have been since Entergy announced the expected shutdown of the plant in 2013. And the twice monthly, actually 2 to 3 times monthly calls that Commissioner Boddicker mentioned were a part of those calls at the health department. In addition, there are other meetings that are held of the various agencies of the state each month. So there are numerous meetings throughout each month. And we also do conduct site inspections. I conducted one today and just last week, and they're very helpful to be able to see some of these things that you're seeing photographic images of. We also are reviewing all of the reports and schedules that are generated by North Star and its contractors. We do independent monitoring of the environment. We have for since before the plant actually started operations. We were collecting air samples, water samples, and direct gamma readings to establish background in the very early 70s, and then after startup in 72 until still today, we collect these environmental samples, and you can see those results at the website that is shown there in that URL. We also maintain radiological emergency capabilities for the state. Our state hazmat team, the Vermont Hazardous Materials Response Team, trains twice a year with exercises here in the local area where they simulate either a transportation accident or a fire that might occur that could create concern among residents as well as others that there was contamination that had left the site. And so we maintain our readiness to respond to those kinds of incidents. And we track radioactive waste shipments with the assistance of the shipping department here at Vermont Yankee. Our environmental surveillance is extensive. We collect water, air, milk, and direct gamma radiation measurements. Most of our samples are off-site currently. Primarily, we're looking at the gamma radiation at the property boundary. We also have extensive monitoring at Vernon Elementary School. We have air sampler. We have multiple dosimeters. We have an online or a constantly on radiation detector in the principal's office. And we also do 2 of the local farms, the Logic Farm, the Miller Farm. And we sample the Connecticut River upstream and downstream for water. And we sample private wells near the site, and we sample Brattleboro drinking water. We also do get some on-site samples that contractors at VY have over the years provided us samples of sediments, fish, and we have also been getting groundwater samples from wells. There are 4 wells that we've consistently been getting samples from in a leach field spreading area. And recently we actually received some split samples of some groundwater wells that are within the protected area, which is of course that area that we're especially concerned about, with our goal, as you can see here with this image, to try to evaluate all of the constituents that could contribute to radiation dose in our ingestion pathway in our everyday lives, to ensure that they are always within the very low limits that we have for both the health department and, by our confirmation, also those that are used by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. I mentioned that we track radioactive material shipments, and this is a graph of those shipments over the year 2019. And we do this, each of the shipments that goes out from Vermont Yankee, the shipping manager sends a report to us. We are tabulating each of the volumes and each of the amounts of radioactivity in each of these shipments. And we also notify all of the law enforcement agencies so that if there were some sort of incident on the roads or elsewhere, or they stopped a vehicle and it had radioactive materials as a part of its bill of lading, they would be expecting these shipments. We do this with all of the entities that transport radioactive materials through the states, and Vermont Yankee has consistently done this over the years. You can see this is a graph that somewhat shows what's happened over the year 2019 in the updates from the team at North Star. And that is that over the months starting in March, there's been a consistent growth in the number of shipments of radioactive materials off-site to licensed disposal facilities. There have been some upticks periodically. The most important one is the most obvious one is radioactivity. That was in April when some very radioactive filters were removed from the rad waste system and shipped to disposal site. And then also you can see that back in October there were a lot more shipments, and obviously that's probably like us with our firewood. We're putting a lot more firewood into our wood sheds in October. They're getting them off the site before the winter comes. We expect to be able to provide these kinds of updates to you not only in our annual reports but at these meetings ongoing. And I'll take any questions.
Go ahead, sir.
Thank you for the report. I have a question just about the water testing and the private and public drinking water. How large of an area out beyond the footprint of the plant are you testing?
We have focused on the immediate drinking water in Vernon in particular. We obtain water samples in, I don't want to say hundreds, but dozens per day from all around Vermont for sampling, because our laboratory does radiochemistry on all kinds of environmental samples for many different reasons. People are concerned about radium in their water or uranium. or radon. We do that testing. So we have great background levels, and also we understand what the rock, the geology does to water throughout the state by taking all those samples. What we're really focusing on and what we report on is what's happening here in the immediate area that could be the result of transitions from activities on site into the bedrock and then potentially into the drinking water aquifers that are, for example, used by the school or local residents. So they're really pretty close, other than the Brattleboro water supply, which is the largest water supply, which we feel is useful for us to test on the basis of the population that uses it.
So just for some specificity, distance, is it within?
Yeah, within miles.
Within miles?
Yes, maybe 2 miles, mostly. As far as the Blodgett Farm to the south, Brattleboro to the north, and West Brattleboro to the west, as well as the river. Yes.
Okay. Let's move on to the Public Service Department update, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The briefing will be given by Jim Porter, the Public Advocate at the department.
Thank you. So I've got my reading glasses, and I think everything is a little bit either too far away or too close, so bear with me a little bit. But, so Tony, if we can just go to the next slide. Just a reminder of our kind of ongoing role in this oversight. Primarily, it's reviewing the financial performance and the work as it's done and as reimbursement is sought. And I'm going to go through these fairly quickly. We may have had some of them at the last meeting. I wasn't here, so I'm not positive. But Tony, if we can go to the next one. Just talks about the department's activities related to this function in 2019. I think you know most of this, and it's been gone over. But we have 2 lawyers internally who deal with this matter. We have a law firm in Boston that we keep on retainer. We have Tony, who you all know. Our internal finance and economic division reviews certain of the, well, everything, and then we have hired consultants this past year who do an ongoing review of all the financials. And I think you all know this. If we can go to the update since the last meeting. Not too much. One thing, we did have a site visit with our technical consultants in late December. And then Representative Sibilia submitted some questions to the department, and a letter was sent to her and I think to all of you, but we were also going to deal with some of those responses in this slide presentation. Got major activities on site. I think those have been gone over in earlier slides. Financial updates, the trust balances, and then the next one is disbursements from NDT. The next one, disbursements from SRT. Kind of financial status of the project is the next one, with some little pie charts. We also, that go along with these, have fairly detailed spreadsheets. I did not put them in here, but they're on our website and they're updated, I think, monthly. And then if we go to the one, Tony, yeah, department's financial review. Are you interested in you just want to look this over and see if you have any questions about? Seeing none, let's move to.
Mr. Chair, I think this is the end of the presentation until we get to my questions. May I ask a question on this piece? So, just one quick question with regard to the disbursements slides. I know we have a date of notice and the amount requested. Is the amount dispersed always the same as the amount requested?
I think thus far it has been. We have the ability to object to a disbursement, and we have not done that thus far.
So, yes, thus far it has always been the same. The amount requested has always been the amount dispersed thus far. Okay. That's my question. Thank you.
And I think it may have been questions about one of the disbursement months that precipitated the site visit with the consultants this past month. So, but as I say, no.
I'm sorry, would you?
So our consultants had some questions about some of the items in one of the disbursement schedules that we received, and they actually came here to meet with North Star people, and their questions were answered, but they do monitor these every month.
And so what was the nature of the question? Was it about the cost estimates, or whose is that? Okay.
I believe it was the cost submitted and the work that went along with it.
So was it a look back or something going in front? So something that had already happened or something that was
like I said, it already happened because I think it came about from a request for a disbursement for repayment. So
okay, and the consultants found that there was no
thumbs up right after their site visit.
Okay.
They were very pleased, I believe.
Does anybody else have any questions regarding the update before we move on to the responses to the questions that were laid out by Laura? Okay, seeing none, we will move on to those responses.
Great, and everyone got a copy of the letter. Okay, and so if you go to the next slide, Tony, estimated cost to complete the project. So, and as this indicates, this was based upon the record that was before the Public Utility Commission when this transaction was approved. And I believe the total estimates were about 811 million. And then you've got a breakdown below that. Any questions about this? Great. So if you go to the next, I think one of the questions was, is there uncertainty built into the estimated cost? And as you know, there's an extremely detailed model that was used for this. And I think the first bullet talks about the 900 line pay item disbursement schedule. I think there's a 10% contingency built into each line item. Broadly speaking, North Star bears the cost if there's a shortfall, but obviously the idea is for them to make money with this transaction. The next slide really goes to kind of what was about 90% of the context of the transaction that was before the PUC. And it was, I think, fairly early on, the parties believed that North Star had the expertise to do this. The question was, did they have the financial wherewithal? And there was much work done with financial assurances and essentially everything that could be thought of that could reasonably put together to ensure that the funds would be there to complete the decommissioning. And then this has, I'm sorry, I really can't see, but this has bullets of the various components of the financial assurance package. Estimated percentage of the work complete, I think approximately 14.9, 15% complete. Current schedule, looking to the end of January in 2027. March 31st of each year is kind of a big reporting date, kind of, you know, the yearly reports of various things. This will be the first complete year that will be analyzed and put together. So I think that piece will have a lot more information on that at the May meeting. Our consultants, 4 points. They, you know, thus far believe everything is on track as it's supposed to be. I think one of Representative Sevilla's questions was, what happens if there's a surplus when all the work is done? I think 55% of surplus funds would go back to ratepayers. And then some piece would go to North Star as successor in interest to Entergy. And then the question I think she may have been more interested in was what happens if there's not enough money. And that, as I think the commissioner wrote very nicely in her letter, truthfully, nobody knows. To some extent, again, every effort was put in to see that that doesn't happen. And with the various monitoring, I certainly think, or the idea is that if something was not going according to schedule or that was of concern, that we would see it, you know, long before it became a problem. In some scenarios, as the letter says, it could be go back to safe store, which we all remember that. But there are many scenarios, and it's a little bit hard to answer. We talked a little bit about the annual reports that'll be coming in at the end of March. Excuse me. Please ask me some questions.
I'm writing a list.
Okay, thank you.
If you're ready with your list, I think
Sorry.
he's ready.
Okay, sorry.
Thanks.
Excuse me. And they're not, I don't think they're anything, thank you. This is a helpful report. I appreciate the care and attention that went into the letter, and I think the explanations were really helpful.
Great.
A few questions. I heard you say that with regard to the surplus, 55% would go back to the ratepayers, and some piece would go back to North Star. That's a fairly imprecise.
40, I think it's 45.
Okay, thank you.
I was having trouble deducting 55% from 100, but I think it's 45.
Okay, and with regard to the.
Can I just follow up to that?
Sure.
Real quick? Just for the watching public, could you just briefly describe what the Vermont Yankee Nuclear Power Corporation is? Because since we have a shutdown plant, people may wonder, well, why does that thing still exist and what is it? And why is only 55% going to Green Mountain Power Corporation?
So the 55% to Green Mountain as most of you know, the plant was originally owned by our electric utilities. We had Central Vermont Public Service and Green Mountain Power each owned a piece. When Green Mountain Power acquired or merged with CVPS, you know, those entities became one, and that was a larger percentage. Okay.
Okay. With regard to the now the annual reports that are coming in March, these are really an analysis of the financials, what was said and what is happening. Is that right?
Financials, balances, where the money's invested, work completion, so all of those things. From our perspective, this is just from our perspective, what we look at.
And so in terms of some sort of warning or red flag that there is an issue, since we've established that we can't really know for sure until we get to that place if we have enough funds, what types of red flags would the department be looking for in between marches?
So let me answer that from the least technical person that touches this project from the department. But I think if you saw big overruns in line items, if you saw a big decrease in any fund balance, anything, as I say, and the experts, there's so much information and it's so granular that I think they're able to monthly kind of look at the work, how it's being done, is the work value of the so I think you would start to see something financially fairly soon. So from my perspective, that's the type thing they would see. If North Star, not North Star, 4 Points were here, I'm sure they could give you a lot better detail as to what they might see.
If I could offer something on that point. We will be getting these reports March 31 as the presentation shows, and the department is happy to look into having 4 Points attend in May, I think it is, to take your questions at that time. And that would be an excellent question to ask them from a technical perspective. What we're able to tell you is that, for instance, with the December 12th site visit, when they see something that gets their antenna going, that's the procedure that we follow. So that monitoring is ongoing through the year. And then again in May, once the comprehensive reporting is complete, we're happy to make them available for your questioning.
So I do think that would be helpful, Mr. Chair, to have them come when we get that report here.
And Laura, and then there's also the MOU with that
Right.
Emily was talking about.
You're pointing, and that makes me nervous, Chris.
Sorry.
No.
No. But what Commissioner Bodeker was talking about, that's another opportunity to catch something.
Yeah.
So.
Oh, yeah, and I should have said, I'm really talking about the money, and of course, you've got the whole A&R contingency, and they're on site doing visits. They have their own consultants.
Right.
So I'm really was talking from the financial perspective.
We're also, in trying to answer your very appropriate question, we are dealing with hypotheticals. So I would offer this one to you. Let's say, for instance, that with A&R's work, an unanticipated environmental attribute is discovered that materially alters some of the financial assumptions that have gone into planning this decommissioning. So that would be a noted or a material event. If the experts from our shop see financial consequences that attach to that, for instance, that it would lead to a precipitous withdrawal of a size from the trust fund that is not anticipated, that would be the kind of thing that that they would want to analyze, and we would want them to as well, in order to ascertain whether there's some sort of reconfiguration of the 900 item schedule that needs to be considered. If that helps you.
That does help.
That's reported within 7 days too, per the MOU, as I recall, right?
Yeah, yeah, it's a very intricate mechanism, but yes, in a nutshell, you're right.
So thank you. That's very helpful. I appreciate again all of the time and care. That's really all of my questions right now with regard to the financial. And what I have learned through this process is how important and necessary it is to continue to have these public opportunities to understand how we're progressing. I want to be clear that at this point, I have no concerns about the finances, but I think that given that we can't actually know until we're done, I think we have really underscored the need to have regular reports on this. I do have one other question after.
If I could just add something to your comment, though. I could not agree with you more, because I think the transaction and really the plant itself, I cannot recall a time in doing this work, and I've been doing it for 20 years, where folks were not asking the question, one day when this plant no longer operates, are the resources going to be there to decommission the site? And there have been a variety of combos about, is it just decommissioning or is it restoring it, and to what degree, et cetera, et cetera. This is a long, storied conversation that has occasioned much discussion, and I think the fact that this panel was preceded by yet another panel tells you how personally the public takes the topic. And so I commend you, Representative Sibilia, for the attention that you continue to draw to these conversations and the monitoring, and the other panel members who have been in touch with me about this. And I can assure you that the department is fully vested in not just reporting to you as we did in the letter, but also committed to this public forum. I mean, this is very Vermont. And it's something that catches the eye across the nation, really, as other states start looking at these processes as well. So you can certainly count on the department to continue to make fulsome public reports. That has been our custom all along, and we'll continue to do that.
And could I follow up and ask the committee kind of a process question? So I've not been to one of these meetings in a while. I hope to start coming to these regularly now. We have a very smart, highly technical lawyer who understands all that, who loves to make these PowerPoints. We are putting more and more information on our website. If you want to look at spreadsheets, if you want to look at the details, they're there. What do you like in the way of slides? Those of you who know me, I'm a little more colloquial. I'm a little more interested in do you have questions? Is there something bad going on? What are you guys doing on a monthly basis? Do you enjoy the technical piece of the slides, or a little bit more of a narrative for these?
Well,
you can think about it.
May I will speak for myself and say I don't think that we are the sole audience. So I think that that's something to take into consideration.
And I would just like to add that this is great. And in addition to your website, I feel like the ENDICAP panel in and of itself is the primary way for the public to engage with all of this material. So in these slides, if there are links to some of that technical reports that might be buried in your site, I know that there's a lot of care. I've dug in there, and there's a lot of information there. But this is yet just another way. This is the mechanism, I think, that the public gets it, because we get through BCTV and there are all sorts of links. So I appreciate you asking the question.
Could I follow up on that? As a matter of curiosity, Mr. Chair, if you don't mind, because I'm mindful of our time tonight, did you find it difficult to find the materials on the website?
Not most of the time.
Okay, but some of the time.
Some of the time.
Well, if I could ask if you want to contact us and let us know, that would be most helpful. We always want the feedback.
Sure. Thank you.
This might not be a question you can answer. There might be someone else that can answer, but it's not on. Okay, there you go. The spent nuclear fuel management fee, the almost 288 million. Until what date does that presuppose the management of said spent fuel? Do we know, does that end with the projected end of decommissioning, or up to when does that management go on in terms of this budget analysis?
That's an excellent question, and I expect that different parties see the answer in a different way. What we have right now are the known resources. That's the number you're looking at. What we also have, if I'm not mistaken, is federal law that says that the federal government is supposed to take title and possession of this waste and dispose of it conclusively. And as you well know, maybe better than I, the federal government has made interim arrangements at best. And so when that question is going to be resolved is something that I don't know. And I will not sit here and tell you that I know whether the number that you're looking at is sufficient to cover until that day comes.
Well, no, what I wanted to know is up until what date does this number presuppose?
I don't think the number does presuppose. I think rather the number is the number. And it remains to be determined how long it's going to be necessary. And I think that logically points to a question all of us ask, which is what happens if the end time is not achieved before the money runs out? End time meaning the final disposal of the waste.
So this number was projected without an end date in mind, Corey?
I think that the number exists to reflect what we know to date.
And do we know how much on an annual basis spent fuel management is expected to cost moving forward?
So I would not be the person to answer that question.
I'm kind of asking Corey.
We can start with the company and see what their view is. Tony, unless you have a number on that.
Well, to answer the first part of the question, I don't remember the exact date for the spent fuel management, but the projection, if I recall correctly, and I think Corey or David can correct this, is out through the end of what was originally the safe store period. So we're talking to approximately the 2060s at this point, but Corey's going to update this.
I can shed just a little light on that. So that number, I believe, was generated with the original projections, and it was an estimate that the DOE would be able to execute on its commitment to retrieve the spent fuel by 2052. So the original numbers were
That's
built
what I was
out
looking
for that.
Okay.
We cannot give you an exact number for the year-to-year costs, but that's a great question, and what I can share with you is the historical average for the last few years in the New England region, considering the other independent spent fuel storage installations that exist, are around $9 million a year.
Yeah, I had thought it was 10, but okay. Well, that's interesting. One last question, may I? My understanding is that the decommissioning of Vermont Yankee is the largest industrial project currently at play in the state of Vermont. Is that correct? And if so, what's the next largest?
That's a good question. I don't know.
And frankly, I don't think either one of us is in a position to answer that question. I don't know what the definition of industrial is, and there are limits to what the department can responsibly say on something like that.
Okay. Well, if anybody
Is
can
that
send me
okay?
information on
'Cause
that, I'd be interested to know.
I'm seeing looks down the panel, so.
Well,
I wonder if that's a question for Commissioner Bodek, or is it more of a cleanup question? Is that what you meant, Lissa?
Yes. Well, just.
Like an industrial cleanup? Is that what you meant, or what did you mean?
Just in terms of the raw value of the work being done.
Oh, no, okay.
I know there are some other large hazardous sites like the Pine Street Barge Canal in Burlington. Work kind of occurs at these large sites intermittently, and a lot of that is based upon when federal funds become available. So just an example, we've actually finished out this year $6.2 million of work at the Pine Street Barge Canal, but that wasn't the first. So once you actually have a full site remediation plan, you then kind of have to get in the queue in terms of when you can get federal grant funds. So to total up one of the large sites like the Pine Street Barge Canal or like the Superfund sites, certainly if it'd be of interest to the panel, I can get a total for you for Elizabeth Mine, what's been spent over the last 30 years. So you can get an idea of the magnitude. So we are fortunate that we have very few Superfund sites. Elizabeth Mine's probably one of the most well-known. Those that are downtown, Pine Street Barge Canal is a really good example. And we have very few, but we do have one site like VAG, which is the asbestos mine up above Morrisville and Hyde Park, that was never designated as a Superfund site. Therefore, there has been no cleanup as a result of being designated as a Superfund site. So I can certainly get some examples for you so you can kind of put this work in context. This is, to the best of my knowledge, by far the largest and by a very substantial amount.
Largest what, though? Largest hazardous waste cleanup site?
Yeah, largest hazardous waste cleanup site. Obviously, with this having a radiological component on top of it. If you have a look at it in terms of the other hazardous materials that are non-RAD, that are under DEC, I don't believe it would be the largest, but I'd be very happy to get you some context for the next meeting.
No, it's not necessary. I'll look into it myself.
Okay.
Thank you.
So I just want to echo what Representative Sibilia said, that when anybody's presenting, whether it be your department or previous departments, please understand that you're actually representing to the entire public and not just this board. Panel, do we have further questions for anybody? This is kind of our time to, if you thought of anything between, the start of North Star's presentation to now, to ask those questions before we move on to public. Go ahead.
Of course, I have one more, but I think this is it, Mr. Chair. So with regard to the March reports that we're going to get, and I did speak to several of you today about this, would it be possible for us to get an overall update on the progress with the MOU? Not just the finances, but the MOU itself.
Oh, yes, we would have, that's what we would plan as a matter of course, and I think that's a really good thing to keep doing.
And I would like to just make sure that we are understanding each other. So for me, that would mean kind of walking through the MOU, and these things there's no issue with these things are done.
Correct.
Are there any confidentiality issues that would arise from kind of a progress update on the MOU?
The way I would handle that is that we will report on everything that we can within the public sphere. Anything that's confidential, we would identify it as such and explain why it needs to be confidential. I don't think that will be the overwhelming bulk of it. It should be really minimal, but there is some confidential material, yes. There are aspects of that in the case.
So, Mr. Chair, I would, given the number of reports that are coming in, I would ask that we maybe think about an interim meeting between now and May, or that we move up that May meeting. Thank you.
If I could just add one thing to what you said, Representative Sibilia. With the number of reports that are coming in at the end of March, we anticipate that, certainly from our perspective, that our consultants will probably take a month to try to look and digest. So, thanks.
And I mean this as respectfully as I can possibly say it. These reports are also going to be posted as soon as the department can put them out there. And we do need folks to read them and process them. so that the time spent here can be this kind of engaged discourse. And I appreciate your comments, Representative Coffey, about how this panel is the primary access for the public to assimilate the information and understand the information that we're sharing here. But I can't overstate the importance of actively engaging as well by going to our website if that is the interest that the public has, because a lot of resources are going into making that website user-friendly and comprehensive. It's a lot of information to digest, and I think we need to make our peace with that.
Anyone else on the panel have any questions before I open it up to the public? Seeing none, we will take public questions now regarding the North Star and state reports. Seeing no questions from the public, we will open it up for general public comments for those folks that can't stay through the end of the meeting. And we do have one. Come on up.
Hi, I'm Ann Darling. I live in East Hampton, Massachusetts. I used to live here for a very long time, raised my son here. I wanted to know if it sounds like there isn't, but is there a schedule of meetings of NDCAP for the next year, let's say? It's a regular schedule? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, May is our next meeting. We have not scheduled them out. What we typically do is schedule the following meeting based on our needs. As Representative Sibilia mentioned, there may be a time where we need to move up our meetings from, our normal 3 or 4 month schedule. So no, there is no exact schedule. It kind of depends on the needs of the panel.
Okay. So I was notified of this. I'm on the list to get notifications, and I was notified on January 8th of this meeting. So it may have been in the minutes or something from the last meeting, but I didn't hear about it until a few days ago. And it is a tremendous amount of information to digest for people like me who have a full-time job and other things that we do. I'm probably not atypical for people who are, having a hard time keeping up with all of it. And I'm really interested in it. Not everyone is, I will admit. So I would, you may have met the qualification or the standard for noticing a public meeting, an open meeting, but that really isn't enough time to get people here, and there are very often very few people here, usually very few people here. And it is a problem, I think, that this is so complex, and so you have to read so much and know so much to understand it. And I don't really know how to deal with that. But this is not what I would call real engagement of the public, because there's so few of us here. I know in the MOU it does talk about some form of public engagement. I see that North Star is working with the town of Vernon, which is fabulous. Absolutely should be working very closely. But beyond that, how to pull people in and do education in the community so that people can understand these complicated reports. It would be really nice if that could happen. I know it takes money, and I don't know that there are resources for it. There are groups in the community that I'm part of and other people are part of that might be able to be allies in getting that information out to the public, or getting people in here, so that you're not talking to yourselves all the time. So those are my thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne, for bringing this up, because we don't always know how the information about the meetings is going out. And I'm curious, because that's news to me that people would have heard about this meeting only on January 8th. So, because we set this meeting date at our last meeting in December. So what are the mechanisms? Is it just that this gets posted according to open meeting law, or is there a mailing list? Maybe Tony, would you mind? You might be able to answer that better than anybody.
Yeah, I can, and I appreciate the question because this is something I'm trying to emphasize more. The NDCAP does have a website through the Public Service Department. As soon as we know a meeting date, we do at least get the meeting date on that website. Now, what Ms. Darling is referring to is we typically get a press release out. We try to do this about a week in advance because past experience was that, well, if we went 2 weeks, 3 weeks, people would forget and we weren't getting turnout. We can attempt to do that earlier, but I would just emphasize to people, do check the website. We keep it as up to date as possible. And that will always have what information we have available. Now, with regard to the technical information that was put up on the website this week, I will point out that this part is a new process for us. Really, with the exception of tonight's meeting, we very seldom had the technical presentations available prior to the meeting themselves. So this is something that we committed to at the December meeting, that we would make an effort to get this done earlier. With the time of year, I did not get any of the presentations until this past week. So we got them up as quickly as we could, and I thank everyone who made the effort to assure that we had them in advance. But I think with the next meeting being on May 4th, unless the panel decides to have one between now and then, we can push that effort a little bit earlier to assure that there is at least maybe draft presentations available, say a week or a week and a half prior to the meeting. But that will depend upon the individual authors of the presentations.
Tony, is there any notification that goes out when there is any kind of and I don't mean minor, when there is any kind of a major update or information, a new report, new documents, or a new meeting? Is there any automatically just an email that goes out that says, the site's been updated to the interest list?
At this point, no, but that's something that I think we can consider. June, we may have to talk about that just to set up a ground rule, because right now, any type of release that would go out, I have to run through her office for approval. Some of these, if they're very routine, I think we could just send out automatically, say, hey, the website's been updated with this.
Yeah, I think there's a distinction between the press releases that you're talking about, yes, Tony, and what you're getting at, Representative Sibilia, which is, for instance, if a letter comes out from the NRC. Is that fair? Or if one of the congressional delegation does something, or something that is of interest to the NDCAP and in turn to the public that follows the NDCAP. And what you're asking is, do we have a mechanism by which we push that out automatically to not just NDCAP but also to our website? I think, I'm sorry to have to say this, but the department is not the sole source of such information. There are other state agencies as well, and arguably legislative developments as well. So now we're talking about how do we best aggregate all of that and push it out. And I do not have a person who could staff a web content management function in a way that would, I think, satisfy the ideal of what you're saying.
So I think this is probably something that we should stick a pin in to explore further. I've noted that you've stressed the importance of folks maintaining their knowledge with what's on the website. And I certainly recognize that the department is not swimming in staff and time to do all of this, but certainly someone is uploading a report.
But
And
you're
it
thinking
seems
of
like
something like a
may I
newsfeed,
finish,
right?
Commissioner?
Yeah, of
It
course.
seems like there should be some mechanism that minimizes risk of inaccurate information going out. So if something is permissible to be posted, that there's some sort of operating procedure that is established that can be pushed out. I recognize that there's information that comes from all sorts of places, but if that is our focal point, the ENDICAP website, it seems like that might be something we should try and work on in terms of some sort of standard operating procedure when there's something, a new report.
Yeah, I'm
or a
hearing two
meeting
different
date.
things. I'm hearing that you want a standard operating procedure, and I'm hearing that you want a current, constant feed of things as they go up on the website. Am I hearing something wrong?
So I think when the website is updated with a new report or a new date is put up, I certainly, there's 10 reports that were put up for this meeting, so I wouldn't expect 10 notifications. But
That was what I was hearing, so that's not what you expect, and I agree. We should be able to do something in an aggregate way.
Yeah.
But what I was hearing was that you wanted it to have it happen every time we do something.
So what you should hear me say is I think this idea merits some investigation as to what is reasonable
That sounds
to
fair to
increase
me.
the transparency. Is this something that we can maybe take up at a future meeting?
What I'm noticing is that my fellow state agencies aren't weighing in on the question, and it has implications for them as well, so perhaps they'd like to speak to the point.
Do they post on your site all of the information?
The entire NDCAP, including the business of the other members as well, if you have any. For instance, your query to us, if it had come in writing, that's something I would expect to put on the website.
Yes, it did come in writing.
I'm trying to remember that. I don't recall that, but I'll take you at your word, as I always do, Representative Sibilia. Do the other state agencies have anything to say on the point?
I think it'd be an opportunity for us to talk with our IT folks. I have to confess I don't know the full capabilities of the website, but if there'd be a way to automate notifications once files are posted and a way to batch, we can go onto multiple sites these days and give me once a week an update. I confess I do not know what capabilities we have within the IT website system, but we can ask the question.
Yes.
May I just offer a simpler solution? I'm mostly concerned with the comment that was made about people not knowing about our meetings. So I would like to tease that apart just separately. And maybe it's something that's triggered by the issues committee meeting, that we do in advance. And if we do that, we would need to do that regularly. But I do think that when people know about our meetings, then we can have more robust engagement, and I think that's really important. So if there's a simple way, I don't know if there is a list that exists of an email list of interest groups, but does such a thing exist is my question.
Yeah, I can answer that quickly. The short answer is yes. There is a public interest list that I believe Kate O'Connor actually started, but I have inherited and maintained. And I think we have somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 people on that list right now. And if anyone is interested in joining the list, contact me. I actually have a slide I plan to put up during the break that has contact information, how to contact the panel, because it hasn't been put up recently.
And I'll just speak to one thing. Your question about the lack of participation in the public currently. I believe it has a lot to do with the sale being complete. Prior to the sale being complete, this room was fairly full on a regular basis. And I think the interest in the public has waned since the sale has been complete, because now we are really, as you mentioned, starting to get in the weeds of very technical things in these reports, and I don't think it really interest the general public in a lot of cases, except for someone like yourself and obviously the panel and the folks that are here. So I think that's part of the lack of public participation at this point. But if there is a better way that we can disseminate information, especially our meetings, we will definitely do that in hopes to find more people like yourself to attend.
I kind of am a dog with a bone, I will admit. I think you may well be correct, but I wouldn't. And yeah, I think people feel very relieved after all the years of conflict that things have calmed down and they don't want to really be in the middle of it anymore. But I do believe that this is very important for people's lives and well-being, and that they may not understand some of the basic things that are happening right down the road, and that if they did, they might be more engaged. I wouldn't want to see you say, well, people just aren't interested, so we don't need to try.
And I didn't mean to come across in that manner. As I mentioned, if there's a better way for us to get out the information, we absolutely will do that. I was just making a generalized observation from the time we started, really getting engaged in the sale till now.
No, I didn't take it that way. Yes, this room used to be full. I was there too. All right, thank you very much.
But there was also the issue of people feeling endangered, which is no longer the case largely.
Come on up.
Hello. I'm just here to introduce myself. I think you might have heard at the last meeting about the possible project that Antioch University was going to be partnering with North Star and with the town of Vernon. And so really we've just begun the project. The contract was just signed among all the partners, and we're assembling the graduate student team right now. So I just wanted to give you a quick little introduction. I'm Krista Daniels. I work at Antioch as faculty right over the border in Keene, New Hampshire. And we've been assembling the graduate student team, which is great. We have 2 master's students that are GIS advanced students that are going to be working on this project. We actually also have a doctoral student that's going to be doing some of the photojournaling and documenting of the decommissioning process. So there's that part of the project, and then the other part of the project, which I find very exciting. I have nothing to report on yet, obviously, since this is just the beginning. But the students will be doing that landscape suitability analysis, which is really looking at the whole site and putting together layers of the site in GIS mapping. So they're going to look at hydrology, physiology, microclimate, and really it's basically to just say, here is the site, here's the ecological characteristics of the site, here's past human settlement, here's the history of the site, and it's to give more of a foundation as a basis for what you might do with that site, what the town might do with that site moving forward. So it's to give as much information on that as possible. And so I find that very exciting. We've looked kind of around the country to see if there were any other examples of this partnership, and we have not seen that yet of all the sites that are being decommissioned, where you're seeing the actual decommissioning site, the city it resides in, and an academic institution coming together to say, let's work together to look at what's going to happen next, or what information we can produce for people to make a good decision moving forward. So I think that's very exciting. I think it's going to put this area on the map. We've already been asked, just from mentioning the project, to present at national conferences, so that's exciting too. And so hopefully, once we get the students together and we can start looking at all the information, there'll be a time for us to figure out, we know we'll be presenting to the town of Vernon and North Star on regular basis, but maybe we can come back here and kind of showcase the results to you all as well as we move forward.
So, very excited about this project. One thing, and we do have Deputy Commissioner Long is here from ACCD I hope that there will be opportunities to keep both the state and regional economic development and planning commissions kind of apprised of the work as you're going along. I think it's groundbreaking, innovative, really exciting, and kudos to all of you.
Yep, we will. And the good thing about the first part is that it'll also be accessible, very accessible to the public, because part of the project will entail not just creating these GIS maps that we're going to bring to events like this, but we're actually going to do a storyboard, which is where it can be linked off the town website, it can be linked off of our website. Anybody, any member of the public can just click on the link and it'll look like a storyboard. It'll show the mapping that's been done, and it actually has text along with it that's very user-friendly for people to understand what the site looks like and what we found so far. So it'll be a good also area of engagement for folks to kind of see what's happening very quickly.
So I'm Chris Camden, Executive Director, Wyndham Regional Commission, and we're the GIS resource and mapping resource for the region, but also the towns. We have lots of town maps, already all kinds of data layers, so you don't have to, if you don't want to reinvent the wheel unless it's just part of what you want the students to learn. We've got all those data layers, so just feel free to reach out to us, and we're happy to help provide resources to you guys for your work.
Sure, thank you.
There's a lot of excitement at this end of the room, but anyway, I've been hearing about this project for brewing for a while, so I'm really excited that you did it, that you were able to get the funding together. And can you remind us where, like, I think it's, did the town get a grant from ACC, the Agency of Commerce and Community Development, to match some of the funds with North Star? Is that true?
Yes.
Great, that's great. Well, congratulations. It's a really exciting partnership, and any way that we can be helpful.
What is the budget and timeline for your work?
So right now, ANIAC's portion of the work is really from January through December. So it's just 1 year project, just kick it off and see how it goes. And right now we're working with a budget about $35,000.
Have any students been assigned to the project yet?
We have, yes, we just signed, they're called work study forms. They're actually not part of federal work study. We're paying outside of federal work study, but they're work study forms. They have to be full-time students matriculated at Antioch. So we just signed contracts with 3 of the students for the spring semester. Some of those students may continue into the summer and fall. Some might be graduating, so we might switch out students, but we'll have at least 3 students through the spring, at least 1 over the summer, and then 3 again in the fall, maybe the same 3.
Can we anticipate they will be at these meetings?
So they will be, the way it's written in right now, depending on how many meetings there are, I know that they will be presenting to the town of Vernon twice in the spring. And so that's written into their project and their budget right now.
I'd like to also suggest that you present in the town of Brattleboro some of your findings at some point, and I'd like to offer you a space to do so downtown.
Okay, I think we're all set. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
All right, I'm going to take a general consensus of the panel. Do we want to take our 5-minute break, or do we want to push forward?
Go.
Can we take a 1-minute break?
Sure, we'll take a 2-minute break. How's that? We'll reconvene literally in 2 minutes. Okay, we are reconvened. It is 8 o'clock, which means we are exactly on schedule. The next item on the agenda is to review panel legislation changes draft, which you should find in the packet that we handed out at the beginning of the meeting. This was introduced by Representatives Coffey and Sevilla.
Mr. Chair, it has not yet been
Has not been
introduced.
introduced. Okay, apologize. So if we can take a look down through the draft, you'll see the things that were removed, and anything that's underlined are the additions to the draft. And this is something that we need to have done so you guys can introduce it. We need.
That's correct, Mr. Chair. We wanted to wait until this meeting, but we remind the panel that deadline for introducing any legislation, we have to turn this in by the 15th. So we would like to be able to have a clear sense of what the panel would like to do so we can move this forward as quickly as possible. Sound good?
Yep. So I am going to assume everybody has taken a look at this at some point. So I'm going to open it up for questions, comments, concerns about the changes that were made, things that were struck out of the legislation, and things that were added. And if nobody says anything, I'm going to assume that their draft is perfect.
Mr. Chair, I'm happy to say something. I thought the changes reflected faithfully the discussion that we've had to date. The one thing that is not in here that I've been holding in reserve, and I'll defer to the panel as to whether it's a today or another day issue, but we are amending or purporting to amend section 1700. And I've tried to do a quick look here to see whether that's the same section that also covers who pays for the support of NDCAP. And my quick look says, yes, that is the same section, at which point, to borrow Representative Sevilla's phrase from a moment ago, I'd like to put a flag in this issue, a pin in this issue, as to who pays for this, because I think it's time that the company assume that cost. And the statute right now doesn't read that way. The statute right now provides that the funding comes out of my budget.
May I?
Go ahead.
So there are two ways that we can handle that. And this is the way I would recommend that we handle that. That we don't put that into this draft, and that the Issues Committee, working with the administration, makes some sort of recommendation, if that's the case. A financial support recommendation would need to, really should be flagged pretty soon, I would say. The governor's budget hasn't come out yet, but we probably would want the Issues Committee to meet and make a recommendation. There will be some want for a recommendation. So.
I just want to make sure I understand, because I'm not talking about using state funds. The law right now says that my agency's budget has to pay to support this committee. What I'm suggesting is that the law be changed so that North Star pays to support this committee. And so, this is a combo that we've been trying to have for about a year and a half.
So do we have a recommendation on the amount?
I would simply say that it ought to be couched the way it is now. It's just that the language right now reads, the source of funds. Funds for this purpose shall come from the monies collected under 30 VSA 22 for the purpose of maintaining the Department of Public Service and such other sources as may be or become available. So I would suggest that ought to be changed to simply say that funds for this purpose shall come or shall be paid by North Star, and just leave it at that. And I appreciate, this is probably giving Corey a heart attack, and Mr. State as well, who's sitting in the audience. But if we're going to launch this legislative train, my experience is if you go in and open the can, make sure you put everything in there that really matters to you, and this thing really matters to me, which is why I'm putting a flag in it.
Mr. Chair, may I respond? Thank you, Commissioner. At our last meeting, we decided, I took notes, we decided to not put that in here. That was the decision that this panel made, so that's why it's not here. It's not that we're not opposed to it. There is another way to get this, there is another way to get that into this piece of legislation, and it's as it goes through committee.
Understood, then
So,
I'm satisfied.
so I just want you to know that it wasn't that it was oversight, it was a decision that I tracked, but I'm not sure if that was the full intention of the whole group, because we were moving kind of quickly at that point in the meeting, so.
I will defer to your memory. I'm just making sure that the flag gets put in the issue.
I don't recall a vote either, but I was kind of sick and on the phone. But I think it's prudent that the panel vote on this issue.
You can't get it in at this point to the language. Yes, we can. Okay. Well, no.
I would just recommend that it has been something that's been discussed. It's a large burden on the department. It's in other cases of decommissioning, the corporate entity has paid far above and beyond what we've been, allotted in this VY process. And I would just say that I think that as a panelist, I'd like to see that represented in the legislative change.
So I would expect that this is a general request, that there's no limits that have been put on that. My guess is that North Star probably will have something to say about this being an unlimited amount. And so
Having lived with that very burden, I agree. It hasn't been easy for me to handle either.
So I think that, Mr. Chair, that it will be important to try and get a good sense from the committee of the direction. And that may be hard to do this evening, but I think it's something, again, that would need to be done quickly. It will need to be amended in my committee with the dollar amounts. And so...
May I ask, you offered a moment ago that there is another path, and I understood that to be that that path could be through participation in the legislative process, at which point it would be very helpful if the panel itself simply gave direction on the issue, and then we could pursue that path, if you think that would work.
I do think that would work. I have not been a legislator for a long, long time, but long enough to know that in this are people, so let me ask, may I, Mr. Chair? I would like to know if the department and North Star have previously discussed this and have come to some sort of ceiling on this, or some language, some sort of limiting language that is agreeable to both of them before we leave this meeting.
No.
So that, to me, I think would be the prudent...
I disagree. I do. The statute right now doesn't have such a limit, and I don't see a need for a limit. I see a need for the cost driver to bear the cost.
And I recognize that, and I'm not advocating for there to be a limit. What I am trying to share with the panel is the reality of the legislative process. And so this can be worked out here, or this can be worked out in the legislature. And it would be my guess that probably the panel would all be an interested party, and there should be some orderly process in that, is what I am suggesting. Mr. Chair, may I ask North Star if they have if they're willing to comment on this? I'm sure they're not, but may we ask them?
Yes, please.
So that was a surprise, but I understand the concern, and I understand your point. For us to accept an unlimited obligation would be unusual. For us to accept or negotiate some reasonable settlement that would support this panel, we'd be open to that. But I think, and I understand you have an open-ended obligation. Whatever we would support would certainly be before any obligation that you might have. So, you know, if we said we will give $10, that's $10 you know you don't have to spend.
No, I think what you're doing is rewriting the statute on the fly, which I understand. That's not what I'm looking for, Scott. I'm looking for this statute to reflect reality, which is your business is driving costs that Vermont ratepayers are bearing, and I don't think it's appropriate for Vermont ratepayers to bear it, especially given that you're going to be taking what is left of the decommissioning trust fund that was fully funded by ratepayers if you execute on the schedule that you have had approved. So I guess my point is this panel, one way or another, has tried to have this conversation for 1.5 years. It shouldn't be surprising to you that I'm asking for this, because you've been in the room before when I have mentioned that this needs to happen. And I think the legislature in its first iteration chose not to put a limitation on the exposure that the department and with that ratepayers have, except for the judgment that the commissioner brings to bear on what is reasonable. And I'm happy to continue to have that role in making judgments. But I think it's entirely appropriate for the company to bear the risk, if you will, of what those costs are. I don't see a negotiated settlement as being the tack to be taking when we're talking about statutory language. But I am one member of the NDCAP, not the NDCAP itself.
Understood. I hope that this panel and the community at large view our interactions here to have been fair and reasonable and transparent. You know, we try to present as much information as we can. We want to be reasonable about how all of this works. Accepting an open-ended obligation for a public or a private corporation such as ourselves is a pretty unusual thing to do without any control over what those expenditures might be. And I understand, I'm not intimately familiar with the statute, but say the statute allows this group to involve 2,000 members in a trip to Las Vegas. Do we pay for that? I mean,
if I say it's reasonable, yes. If I say that's reasonable, I'm probably out of a job.
So I mean, that's the sort of thing I wonder about. Now, you've got an unlimited obligation to cover this, but you are the sole decision maker of what's reasonable and what isn't, and many of those things, or have more input than I do as a private citizen, so to speak.
Yes.
So those would be my concerns. Representative Sibilia has, I think, some good advice here that we'd certainly like to have some level of discussion. I understand the legislation probably needs to be dealt with sooner rather than later. The session runs through March, through May. I'd be happy to engage and try to find something that's equitable to all the parties and helpful and relieves you of a lot of the burden you have.
No, I really appreciate the attitude, Mr. Chair. I don't want to be conducting a two-party debate here, but I would just orient us to the fact that we're not talking about negotiation. We're talking about what the law mandates. And I think that's testimony that you would be most welcome to give at the State House. If it's persuasive, that's wonderful. But meanwhile, the state of the law is that ratepayers are bearing these expenses, and I don't think that's just. And I think the law should be changed.
I'd like to just share an insight along with that, June, and I do appreciate everything you just said, but I would remind folks that the state of Vermont, along with the folks who live in this state, decided to allow a nuclear power plant to be constructed in the late 1960s and early 1970s. This power plant was in a regulated environment for many years. And when we chose to deregulate that environment, we changed the structure by which that power plant can contribute to the economy, the tax base, and performance function effectively. Additionally, we also, upon deregulation, removed that 70% of the power generation of the state of Vermont or graders through the ratepayers' accountability for ensuring that this power plant, which was designed and operated for those 42 years, is then how it's decommissioned and how it is paid for. In the end of that deregulated environment, when Vermont Yankee became no longer economically viable, and a private corporation determined that it could develop a business model and conduct the decommissioning, and an MOU was developed. The model for the financial ability to do that was built, and that would have probably been the time to have this discussion and determine if that was the right time and place to pay for it. But to unilaterally decide that all of a sudden the persons or the companies performing that decommissioning should now pay for this process that benefits the public and the state, which consume the power and enjoy the benefits of the power plant for all those years, I believe should also be taken into consideration while this discussion happens. So I would just offer that.
So Corey, are you suggesting that the Public Utility Commission would have had the authority to change statute? Or are you saying this should have been resolved through the MOU and settlement agreement process, and that the Public Utility Commission should have changed statute?
Chris, I'm just offering that at that time when that MOU was being developed, it likely would have been more appropriate to include this element of a cost component if it was.
Chris, I think a different way to look at it is this. We developed the MOU. I think you kind of understand how we
I was part of that.
Yeah, you understand how we pay ourselves as we go.
Yeah.
We would have, if this were to be, if this were known to be an obligation, we would have put that into that pay item schedule, and funds could have been used that have already been accrued to do that. One correction I'd like to point out, Jude, we don't get all of the money in the NDT. We get 45% at the end if we're successful.
But in the period that Corey was just talking about, when the plant was first established, et cetera, it wasn't contemplated you would get any. And that, meanwhile, that fund was paid for by several generations of ratepayers, all of whom received some benefit of the generation. Today's ratepayers receive none of it. But today's ratepayers are defraying the cost of your of our doing this handicap. And I think, as Chris has pointed out, correctly through his question, the PUC wouldn't have had the power, respectfully, Corey, to alter statutory obligations through a settlement. I think what this conversation has revealed is that there is a more robust discussion to be had. It's a shame that the discussion has not been had to date on the timeline that we need, but we live in an imperfect world. And so I'm happy to take a pass on this and go for a further discussion and perhaps considering changes in the next legislative session if that's what the committee thinks is appropriate.
Just briefly, so I'm feeling a little hamstrung because as a party to the MOU and settlement negotiations, I can't talk about what we discussed in those negotiations. So I am fully in favor of taking this to the legislature.
So, Commissioner, I think it can come to the legislature this year. What I'm recommending as the cleanest way to do that is what I was just talking with Representative Coffey. We're either going to, if this gets submitted, it's either getting submitted with your name on it or North Star's, and the other party's going to be up, complaining and trying to figure it out. It would be better if we submit it and then come back in with an agreement. I'm certain, our committee would like, the legislative process quite well. That, if the two parties came in with some sort of agreement, that would be best. That doesn't have to happen. It's not going to happen tonight. It's not going to happen tonight.
I agree. It's not going to happen
And I think
tonight.
that Issues Committee should meet with this as well.
Yeah, I'm happy to have the process take its course. I just think fundamentally, my view is the original statute did not have a cap in place. And I would be hesitant to endorse putting a cap on it now because I have no way of knowing what the conceivable reasonable expenditures are of this committee beyond what has been spent to date. And I know that my judgments have been informed by the fact that we were having to spend department dollars. And I've not had those dollars, as you well know. So who knows what better work the handicap could have done with better funding had it not been understood that that funding was going to come out of my budget, paid by ratepayers who never benefited from this generation. That's the point I'm making.
Okay, let me kind of pull us back together here. So what our two representatives in the room are suggesting is to hammer out the details of the things that we know about right now. Hold off on this discussion until further discussion can be had within our issues committee and you know, with North Star and all the parties involved, and then introduce whatever that decision is later on.
Yes.
Okay.
You can do that. And my chair would be, I think, I cannot speak for him, but knowing him, I would expect that he would welcome a solution being brought to him. And we probably would not take it up if we anticipated that there was a timeline for such a solution until such time.
Okay. And I will make a comment as another member of the panel to Commissioner Tierney's statement. As a business person myself, I understand where Scott's coming from, where I would never offer an open-ended purse string as a private business owner. So I understand, you know, his feelings in it. I understand your feelings in it, how your budget is being affected specifically by this exploration of decommissioning. But I would have a hard time myself signing a open-ended note.
I agree, I would too, but here we are as a panel, and this question has been coming up for the past year and a half, and I'm wondering, would it be appropriate to have a vote on whether we want to amend the language of the legislation as the commissioner has suggested, just to see where the panel is at? So in other words, I would make a motion to amend the legislative language to put the onus on the funding of the panel onto North Star Corporation.
Second. Moved and seconded. Sorry. Moved and seconded to change the said legislation wording to state that North Star is the bearer of the financial burden for the handicap. I'll open it up for discussion before we take a vote.
Can I just clarify, is the motion to amend the language so that it could be introduced, and then your committee will not be working on that language then during the session?
No, it's going to have to be amended in our committee regardless. We would just bring that in right out of the gate.
Right. Okay.
So we would introduce it as is. That's our option right now. Introduce it as is or not. And then it will be amended in the committee. And we could work with Ledge Council to put a clean amendment together that includes that language change, but this is the language that will get introduced.
Understood. Thank you.
Okay, I didn't really understand that. Just so you want to withdraw. Because you can't introduce it if we change it tonight?
So this, because of the timelines in the legislature right now, we had to have long form bills. So there's always a way to get this done. Let's start from there, okay? So in the process that we are in, with a long form drafted bill, they have to be submitted by the 15th. 15th?
The final draft had to
The final draft.
by the 3rd of June.
That's right. The final draft had to be done by the 3rd of January. So what will happen now, it has to be submitted for introduction. It'll be submitted for introduction. It'll be sent to the Energy and Technology Committee. At some point, that committee will take it up, and amendments can be made, adjustments can be made, new language can be sent in, prior to it being voted out and the House considering it. If that doesn't happen there and it moves out of the committee, that can happen on the floor. It has to go to the Senate. It could happen in the Senate.
Okay, so what I'm going to ask, because it kind of sounds like your motion was for more exploration than it is to actually make a movement, that, you know, if you'd like to withdraw your motion, withdraw the second, and do a consensus of the panel?
Yes, that's what I was going to suggest.
Okay.
Maybe at least you'd go in there armed with some information, if not a vote to amend, but to take the the temperature of the panel on this issue, and so how would I word that? Just
So I would ask you to withdraw your motion and
so I
Chris to
withdraw the
withdraw your
original
second.
motion.
Okay, and Chris withdraws his second. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take a general consensus of the panel about changing that specific wording. If you are in favor of changing that wording to put the financial onus on North Star, please say yay. If you are not, nay. Let's start at the end.
Yay.
Nay. 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 Yay.
Nay.
Nay.
Yay.
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 Nay.
Nay. Mr. Chair, may I explain?
Yes, please.
I just want to make certain, there were 4 nays. I heard 2 down here, one from Bob Leach. I missed the first one. Sarah, okay.
And do you want us to raise our hands who said nay?
Okay,
Yeah,
so
please.
there are 5 nays.
Please raise your hand if you said nay.
Okay, 6. Okay, hold one.
7. There's 7.
1, 2, oh, I'm sorry, Emily, I didn't see your hand. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, okay. Hold on 1 second. Please bear with me.
Anybody on the phone?
Remember our telephone.
I'm still here.
Yeah.
Would you be a yay or nay on this particular issue?
I will be a yay.
So Laura, if you'd like to discuss
I think
further.
Representative Coffey also, I would like to just qualify my vote. I am not willing to just give a blanket yes. I would like to see an agreement. I'm in favor of that burden shifting, but I would like to see an agreement worked out that is reasonable.
Just a point of clarification, Mr. Chair. So, Laura, I understand what you're saying, but I thought that what the consensus was about was whether or not the burden should shift, not necessarily whether or not there. I mean, my assumption is yes. I mean, I would encourage, yes, North Star and the Department of Public Service get together, talk about how many hours have you guys been spending on this stuff, what's the cost been like, and that some kind of proposal be brought to the legislature. But right now, I thought what we were talking about was just whether or not we thought the burden should shift.
That's not how the question was posed, though.
I swear I thought that's how the question was posed, but that's what I was voting. That's what I was.
That's what I was voting too.
Perhaps we could ask Member Weissman to reiterate or state whether...
May I first, I just wanted to explain
I
my
understood
vote.
the way Chris understood it.
Go ahead, sir.
I heard from the chair that that the vote was to whether we were going to amend the language to shift the burden. That's what I heard. And explaining my no is that I would like to see I would like to see another path forward, that the Issues Committee come up with language for this that can be brought to into the legislative process. I'm not comfortable giving a blanket yes or no because without the details of what that is. And that's why I'm explaining
What was the vote?
So for clarification, you're both correct. The vote was to have a general consensus on us changing the language to put the onus on North Star. So if you take the last part of that, yes, the vote was to put the onus on North Star, but it was to change the language. If we wanted to do that tonight, was to change the language to say that. So that was the consensus that I asked for. If there's a different consensus that you'd like to have, I'm happy to hear it.
So I would be interested, so I have a different answer if the question is, would we like to move in that direction? And would we like the committee to come back with, would we like North Star and the department and the Issues Committee to work on a solution? My answer would be yes. That is a different answer.
I think what I was getting at was, it's almost like a sense of the Senate. Does the panel feel that the onus should be on North Star, however it works out in the Legislative and the Issues Committee, but that as a sense of the panel, that North Star should be covering that cost, not the Department of Public Service. That was my intention.
Okay. Let's make this quick so we can move on. Please raise your hand if you have an interest to explore the options of putting the financial burden on North Star, maybe not necessarily as a whole, but some of the financial burden on North Star, please raise your hand.
Wow. Okay, so 4 no's at this point is what I'm saying. And Bob on the phone?
I'm going to say yes.
What were the results of the first vote, if I could ask?
The first vote was, I tallied it up, it was 7-7. It was a split down the middle.
Okay, so I guess our direction moving forward here is we need to finish up what we can do tonight, and then allow the Issues Committee, North Star, and the Public Service Department to all work together on finding a common solution on the financial burden going forward. Correct?
That makes the most sense to me. And I'm certain that if a solution is not able to be found, that the individual parties will find their way to the legislature. So I would just love to encourage that collaboration.
Okay. So,
Just one more point on that, which is, I don't think the department uniquely can assess what handicap thinks is a reasonable amount that North Star should pay. I have not had such a cap to date. We have no record of that. What I can tell you with some further digging is what our expenditures have been. That historical rate of expenditure is not necessarily what this committee would want as it charts a course for itself as to the work it wants to do. So I do think it's important for other members to give thought. Just by way of example, if you wanted to retain some experts to advise the panel on issues that we're confronting with decommissioning, that can cost a pretty penny. You may want to have that built into your budget. I have not been in a position to say yes to something like that today because we're using ratepayer funds to pay for this stuff. So I would just encourage other members of the panel to not see this as a department and North Star work it out. This really needs to involve the members of the panel and your vision for this panel.
Mr. Chair, I'm sorry to see it in that light, Commissioner Tierney, but given the notice and the pressure that now exists for this to be considered in this session, that kind of amps up the pressure on everyone. And so for me, maybe the chair would like to consider another meeting to have NDCAP weigh in on how they would like to deal with this. If that was the case, I would suggest you would want to do that before town meeting, if possible. Ask and maybe spend some time with the Issues Committee asking that the various entities, folks ask what material they'd like to have here to make a recommendation.
So I guess I'll leave that up to the panel right now. Do we want to leave this in the hands of the Issues Committee with everybody's input to make a decision to move forward, or do we want to have another meeting as an entire group prior to town meeting to hash this out as an entire panel? Yes.
Yes, Mr. Chair, I am trying to figure out how the Issues Committee developed from a group of, a sub-part of this group that was meeting to identify the issues that might be on agendas for the coming year, has suddenly become a body that hammers out language that would be then either directly or after voting by the full panel, the language adopted. And I think that if this new role of the Issues Committee exists, it might actually color the nature of the membership of that Issues Committee. Because I think the Issues Committee has, as I mentioned, had a different purpose until it's being brought up here today for this purpose of trying to boil down some language relative to something as substantial as legislation.
Yeah, I understand where you're coming from. I think what we've done before in the past and has been done is that the panel has asked the issues committee to bring a recommendation forward. Not necessarily to bring the end-all solution, but to bring a recommendation to the panel to consider. And that's what I'm, suggesting now. If that's not the pleasure of the panel, then we'll have another meeting and do this as a full panel. I have no issues in that. It was just a suggestion as we've done before in the past.
Yeah, I would be supportive of the entire panel getting together, given that this, as numerous people mentioned, actually been a subject of discussion almost since the original meeting of this panel.
Okay, we will, at the meeting wrap up, we will determine what the next meeting date is, and we'll make sure that we have this specific item on the agenda, please, Tony. So let's move forward with this draft that we have in front of us right now, and we will leave the financial issue aside. Do we want to make any changes or alterations to this draft from what you see now?
I move the draft as, sorry.
Go ahead, Chris.
I've been raising the issue about, I do have process concerns with those entities that are being advised having, what's that o'clock? I do have issues with those entities that are to be advised, being able to vote on what they're being advised about. But I don't know exactly how much leverage. I don't know if we want to we can get a sense of the room if we want. But another way I've thought about it is, I know at the last meeting, I think Commissioner Tierney felt like I wasn't trusting her. Frankly, I'm assuming it's not the same people around this table. It could be the commissioner's long gone. I may not be here. It may not be any of these members, but it's more the matter of what is good process. I'm hesitant to drop it. Part of me would like to get a sense about how other people feel about those entities being advised, having a choice in what they're being advised about. I'm also aware that as the regional commission, if things were really to go off the rails and this entity couldn't take up issues, by statute, the Wyndham Regional Commission can hold hearings on anything that the commissioners want to hold hearings on. And so if our communities as stakeholders said, hey, we really need to have a hearing on this issue, we could do that. Now that would probably entail some resources we don't necessarily have, but depending on how deep we wanted to go, but at least we could still host a regional conversation, have a literal public hearing on issues that this panel otherwise might vote not to take up. So there is something of a relief valve, and of course the town of Vernon can do the same thing. The town of Brattleboro can do the same thing. Each of the political subdivisions here around the plant can do the exact same thing. So there are some other escape valves, but I guess if we're okay getting a sense of the room, I would just like to get a sense of the room or a sense of the panel about whether or not the agencies should be able to determine what they're being advised about. So the question is, should the state agencies have a vote on the panel to decide whether or not they are to be advised on matters that come before the panel? Do they get to choose what the agenda is going to be? But if other people don't want to do that, that's fine. I was just...
Mr. Chair, if I may comment. Chris, I know you've felt very strongly about this issue for a very long time. You mentioned me, my name is not trusting you, and I want to be very clear, I trust you with my life.
No, you felt I didn't trust you.
No, I just want to be clear about that because, you and I are solid. But I appreciate the guidance that you and Representative Sevilla were giving last meeting in pointing out that the duties or better said, the concerns that the panel needs to have are perhaps better etched in statute because you can't be sure of who occupies this office next. So I'm past that. You have been trying to bring this issue forward for as long as I've known you. So I think it probably would be good, and as a courtesy to you in your tenure to the committee last year, that we give you a sense of where the panel is on this. One small clarification I would ask is, do you mean for just the state agencies' voting right to be questioned, or are you also concerned about whether Entergy is, North Star is voting? That's an honest question, because I don't know.
Let me relook at to whom it is we're to advise. Let's see. I thought it was just the state.
I can see the
panel shall serve in advisory capacity only to advise the governor, the General Assembly, the agencies of the state, and the public on issues related to the decommissioning. It doesn't mention.
Yeah, I can definitely see your interest in separating the folks to be advised from the folks who are voting on what advice to give them. And so I think what I'm taking from your answer is, for your purposes, you're not also trying to deal with the question of whether North Star should have a vote on what this panel does by way of advising. So I'm good.
But I can see this is not something that folk are particularly excited about.
I'm getting that same feeling, Chris, and not that it's not a important topic. Everything that we bring up as panel members is important in some way, but it doesn't seem as a panel it's something that we're going to jump on.
I'll just note, and I'll let it drop, but just part of the issue here is, and we may not deal with this going forward, but in the early days of the panel, we actually had some struggles with trying to get agenda items on that the state was ostensibly vetoing. And had an issue with that, and I still do. That's water under the bridge, but just from a process perspective, when this was supposed to be the Citizens Advisory Panel, and we had state agencies telling us what the citizens were allowed to advise them on. And this is especially true with a statute that was passed with little, if no, public input whatsoever. It was delivered at the end of the session of the year it was created. I have an issue with that, and that seems very un-Vermonty. So that's why I keep bringing it up, because it's an opportunity to me to rectify a process that to me is fundamentally flawed. But with this, I'll drop it, and I'll keep it on the panel.
What would be your suggestion for rectification?
That those members of
the state agencies have no vote.
Yeah, the governor, the General Assembly, and the agencies of the state can certainly give opinion, but are not necessarily but on the advisory opinions would not vote. And that part of that could be rectified probably through our procedures, because it doesn't exactly say in the statute who can vote and who cannot, so it could be a matter of changing the procedure. But I'm willing to recognize a dead horse has been sufficiently beaten, and we'll leave it at that.
But just to clarify, your rectification would also include that North Star representatives don't have a vote as well, right?
The issue I've had with North Star is that they get 2 votes, and we just saw a tie vote come about as a result of one party having 2 votes. Though I guess you could also look at the state as having multiple votes too, which again gets to the very core issue that I was just talking about. But and who knows, maybe this is a conversation to just continue to be had over the coming weeks, months, years. Yeah.
So is there anything else within the draft language that we would like to edit, change, etc., that we have in front of us right now?
Mr. Chair, since I think what I heard is the panel's going to meet again.
Yes.
You might as well just submit this. You are submitting it unchanged, and keep your edits to 1. maybe
Sure.
one recommendation with anything you'd like edited after such time.
Sure, sounds like it.
Yeah. And certainly, we're happy to work with the committee and the Ledge Council on getting that drafted.
All right. So as a panel, we're going to decide to submit this with the changes that were already made, with the strikes and underlines that are on this draft currently, and then moving forward, make any other changes down the road at this next meeting. Correct? Yes. Everybody happy?
You have a motion?
Great. I don't think we need a motion for it. I think we're good. All right.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chair, at least a consensus or a motion to submit, I think, because there is the option to not submit it at all.
Sure. So let's just do a consensus. Please raise your hand if you would like to submit this draft as written.
Mr. Joe.
With the understanding that it's going to change.
On the phone, please.
I'm raising my hand.
All right, so
Okay.
we're unanimous to
Yeah.
submit. Okay, so I'm going to open up to public comments. I'm getting tired on panel legislation changes. Seeing that we don't have much public left, we are moving on to review the 2019 draft annual report, which was provided to us back on January 6th. I'm sure everyone's read it at least 17 times to be ready for the discussion this evening.
Mr. Chair?
Yes, sir.
I would move that the report, just to go and get the conversation going, that the report be approved, with the exception being any typos that panel members might find that they can get to Tony, and he can subsequently amend as he needs to.
Okay.
Second.
So moved and seconded to accept the draft report, and all those.
I have one question on one number in the report.
Okay.
And it is on line 481 about the on-site water storage. It can hold water as much as 820,000 gallons. I know we've been talking about 1 million gallons in terms of permit. I'm presuming this is the basin, and the basin that you'd referenced earlier in this meeting, it was 1.4 million. So I just wanted to check that number.
Those water volumes are separate. Emily, that water that was cited during that report was actually the planned process water that is contained within the Taurus. It has nothing to do with the groundwater that we may sequester within that volume where the cooling tower used to be.
Okay, good.
Actually, I need to clarify that. The 820,000 gallons posted there, that is basically the condenser. I was not considering the basin when I wrote this report, so I don't know if we want to change that. I'm certainly willing to consider that.
I think that's what Corey was just saying, that it wasn't the basin, no?
Actually, I wasn't. I did not speak to that the same way Tony did. I have to look at the information.
Yeah, you're referring to the Taurus at this point. Yes.
Okay, so are we happy with that number? Okay.
Okay, the only thing I was going to suggest as a possible addition to the report, since we received some numbers this evening on the non-radiological volumes, and also we had some updates on the financial, to actually put those items in the report as well. My thought was for the non-radiological volumes to amend that, basically take the current radiological shipment section, split that as, make that section whatever, 9A, whatever it is, and then 9B be the basically the hazmat shipments.
So I guess I'll ask if that's okay as a friendly amendment to approving it as written.
Yeah.
Okay.
In the line, I guess it's 556, when we voted to eliminate the IBEW representation from the panel, I just think it's important to note that we did so because IBEW is no longer there, and no substitute representative of labor can be included. We didn't take that vote to eliminate the voice of labor, which is how it kind of reads right now. So if we could amend that just to...
Okay, before we do that, what I would ask, I know when did we, okay, that was the December meeting. There is a summary of the December meeting. The section you're referring to is just a summary of what was voted on. I have no objection to adding that, but it may be redundant with what's in the December meeting summary.
Okay, I didn't see that in December, so
okay.
I have to go back.
Well, I'll keep that in mind, and I can certainly add a sentence if it's not there.
Okay, so let's bring this back one more time. So we have a motion to approve the draft with a friendly amendment of adding the non-rad waste to the report. So now I'm going to call for a vote, please. So yay if you're accepting the report, and
Yay.
Yay. Yay.
Yay.
Yay.
yay.
Yay.
Yay.
Aye.
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 On the phone?
Aye.
Okay, unanimous, great. So now I will open it up for public comments on the draft report. Seeing none, I will open it up for general public comments to the panel. Seeing none, I'm going to wrap up this meeting. I will let the panel know that this week I received a resignation from Michael Roop, who is the current Vernon Town representative from the handicap panel. Because I am in the town of Vernon, I know that we have a replacement in the wings, and we'll be appointing that person as a select board at the next select board meeting, and she will be joining us. She's actually in the audience right now, Madeline Arms. She's come to several of our meetings and would like to represent the town of Vernon in that respect, and she's also a planning commission member in the town of Vernon. So all that being said, we need to determine a next meeting date, which kind of sounds like we need to meet prior to town meeting to finish up our language for the legislative draft. So that would mean next month.
Last week of February?
I would recommend that we meet earlier than that, earlier in February, because crossover date is the end of February. And so if this bill needs to be taken up in the House committee to go over, you want to build in, I would think, at least 2 weeks. And there's some time that you'd want to.
February 10th.
I'm gone from February 1st to 21st, so I will not be available.
General consensus of the panel, how does February 10th work for everyone? That gives our legislators enough time, and
I will not be able to attend that. I'll be traveling, unfortunately.
I'll be away.
okay.
The 17th is
President's Day. Let's look at the 18th. Would that work better for folks? So you're going to be back from trips and that kind of thing? That is a Tuesday.
I'm gone most of that week.
And actually, sorry, we can't. Oh, yeah, I can't do that.
We're kind of left with the 3rd or the 24th, as far as like, if we're going to accommodate the legislators.
Okay.
Get to the 24th.
I am available the 18th through 21st, I'm sorry.
What are the dates in question right now, Rich?
So I forgot our legislators are only here on Mondays.
25th?
Mr. Chair.
No. I don't think I have anything that's helpful to add, actually.
Okay.
How about February 3rd?
February 3rd?
I'm away.
Okay. February 3rd, everybody else? All right, let's call it February 3rd then, please. We'll attempt to do it here at the same time, 6 o'clock. We will send out notification, then once we confirm with Brattleboro School that we can be here again. But February 3rd is our next meeting date at 6 p.m. Location most likely here, but we will let you know for sure.
Just a quick question to the panel. Our alternate site is frequently Vernon Elementary School. Would people object if this site is not available to Vernon Elementary?
And Mr. Chair, just for clarification of process, will the Issues Committee be meeting in advance of the February 3rd meeting to set the agenda for February 3rd?
My guess is that we probably won't have the opportunity to, just because of the time crunch. So the outstanding agenda items specifically for this next meeting is going to be the changes in the legislative draft. And outside of that, I don't see a whole heck of a lot on our docket for that meeting.
Keep it focused.
So,
would we want to waive the usual reports from North Star and the state agencies just to focus on?
I would say yes, just because that seems to be awful quick to come back and talk about the same thing 4 or 5 weeks later. So I think if everybody is okay, we will not have an issues committee meeting between now and then, and our agenda will be solely regarding this legislative change on the February 3rd meeting. Everybody happy with that?
Yes. Does somebody have to sit down from this panel, somebody sit down with North Star to try to negotiate the wording that we want to put in here?
You know, the legislation is written, when I read it again, says that the agencies will provide administrative support, and also will ask North Star for support as needed, as you would basically determine. So, just putting that out there, because that's...
There are 2 provisions in the statute. One is the administrative support that you've just identified. The other is a funding issue. It's in a separate part of the statute. And tonight's discussion has been about that part. Not at all. Not at all.
Okay.
Just in terms of preparing for the next meeting, I can tell you if this issue were to come unresolved to our committee, we would be looking for the department to provide us some basis for some explanations, some data for their request, and for North Star to be coming and quantifying, what it is that they're hoping to do if they were to come in unresolved.
It wouldn't be the department's request, it would be NDCAP's request. The department has not undertaken this as a legislative initiative, it's this panel.
I think my point was that if this were to come in, right now you are bearing the cost, is that right, Commissioner?
That is correct.
So I'm pretty sure that if this were to come into our committee, that our committee would probably ask you, I know that I would, how much has this cost you?
I would expect that question.
Then I would also
ask
NDCAP, or ask North Star, what limits do you think would be reasonable to place on this? So
correct, and what we need to resolve as a committee, not as the commissioner, is what does NDCAP think the amount ought to be if North Star says it should be capped at $100,000. The commissioner can't make that decision.
I'm not trying to solve the problem here this evening, Commissioner. I'm trying to kind of show the boundaries of where the discussion would probably take place if it's not resolved here.
And I'm trying to make clear that we keep confusing the commissioner's opinion with what NDCAP needs to provide by way of guidance. So I can come into your committee and I can testify as to historical budgets, etc. But if the counterpoint is, what does X think the amount ought to be because North Star says it should be 100 grand. That X is what this committee needs to solve for at February 3rd, not what the commissioner's best guess is.
All right, so let's, I guess I need to kind of get a sense, because Bob's correct that these initial conversations need to happen between North Star, this panel, and Public Service Commissioner. Do we want to have those discussions in that next open meeting on February 3rd? Or do we want to assign, you know, a person, 2 people to facilitate those discussions with North Star and with the commissioner, and then bring back the resolve to this committee on February 3rd and say, this is what, you know, is acceptable to North Star, it's what is acceptable to the commissioner, and here it is? Or do we want to have that conversation on February 3rd as a whole?
I'm just inclined in terms of public process, and we've got all these appointees, that we just have the conversation about what do we think IndyCap needs going forward, and then who have the conversation about who pays for it. I'm concerned about working within parameters, again, negotiated between 2 parties at this state. A lot of the, I mean, that's been my concern with IndyCap in some regard, because sometimes I feel like, you know, it's been sparring between the state and Entergy, or the state. So I don't want, I would hate for this. Here we have an opportunity just to have an open discussion in the panel without any preconceived notion about where it lands. And maybe we make it for this legislative session. Maybe we don't, but at least we just have a damn conversation about.
If we're happy with that, I thought the direction was trying to get something done for this legislative session, so.
No, I agree, yeah. I mean, and you're right. I mean, I think you're right. I mean, but all I'm saying is, but sometimes things don't work out that way either. So I would love to see that happen, but I just think we've got the opportunity under your chairmanship to kind of do what you were saying too, just have some open discussions as opposed to just.
Okay, so we will have this open discussion on February 3rd, so I'll ask North Star representatives to come prepared with, you know, whatever you can come prepared with without having much knowledge of, you know, the expenditures thus far.
And I will come
and the
prepared with
commissioner.
data about our historical expenditures, and I think you're spot on. We should be talking about this. I would not be comfortable trying to tell the legislature what this panel thinks it needs by way of resources. That's the deliberation that needs to happen.
Okay, so I think we have a direction. We have a February 3rd meeting scheduled to do all of the above. We are adjourned.